Good morning. I'm Felicia Marcus, the chair of the board, and today's Tuesday, August 15th at 9:32 a.m., and the meeting is called to order. Let me first introduce board members. To my left, Vice Chair Stephen Moore. To my right, board member Joaquin Esquivel. Mr. Loffer, will you introduce the staff assisting today, please?
Sure. As the board is light today, so is the executive team. To my right is Chief Deputy John Bishop. Chief Deputy Eric Oppenheimer, as you can tell, is not here. He's enjoying a much-deserved vacation. And then we are joined by Janine Townsend, clerk to the board, and assisted by Courtney Tyler.
Great. Thanks very much. For those of you who are new to us, the building has pretty strict emergency evacuation procedures, so look for the exit nearest you. And if you hear an emergency sound, pick up your stuff and take your friends and proceed carefully down the stairs. We gather at 10th and J if you want to wait with us for the all clear signal to come back. If you need assistance, somebody will take you to a protective area. The meeting is webcast and recorded, so when you come up to the microphone, please make sure that it's picking up. We can hear you without it, but we want to make sure people on the webcast who are tuning in can hear you as well. And then finally, silence your noise-making devices in whatever way you choose. You're just lucky Tam's not here because she bugs her more than it bugs me. If you have an amusing ring, I never really mind all that much. So, okay. Next, we're on to the public forum, and that's the item on which we hear from anyone who wants to speak on something that is not already on the agenda. And we have two today. First, we'll have Ms. Libby Uremovic, followed by Mr. Mark Kraus from PG&E. Good morning.
Good morning.
Ms. Uremovic.
Libby Uremovic, can you hear me? Is it on?
I don't know. Wait, try again.
It's on.
Hello?
Yep.
Got it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Here to talk about the Beaumont Basin. On August 3rd, Jeff Davies from the San Gorgonio Pass Water Agency did a presentation called The Rising Cost of Imported Water. He started out by saying he doesn't know if water is actually rising, could go down. Who knows? There's not enough data. The Beaumont Basin has been in overdraft for well over 10 years, 15 years. In 2002, when it was in overdraft, what they did was a adjudication of the Beaumont Basin that allowed them to legally overdraft it in 10 years. On the pretense that Beaumont was going to build a state-of-the-art recycled water facility and would pour all this recycled water back into the basin, so they had to drain the basin. Well, as you know, there is no recycled water facility. They stole all the money. All of the money for STUMA that was organized was pulled out of bond funds, embezzled, nothing happened. And it was just, it dissolved. After all the fraud, it dissolved. Now there's no water. Jeff Davis's report, he has acquired $55 million worth of water, 1,700 acre-feet a year for 20 years from James Nickel. This nickel water has been paid out and pieced out. So many times people started questioning what is going on years ago, and he's still selling this water that for all intents and purposes is paper water. He's buying it from the north and selling it to the south. He can give
who is he?
James Nickel.
But who is he? Who's he buying it from?
He's buying it from the state. James Nickel has two water districts.
Okay.
I'll email you on it. It was actually my brother's law firm that hooked up this juicy deal with James Nichols. Yes, does not make me happy at all. Look at the full circle here. My father forced the EPA into action in the 60s. My brother drains the basins, gives out water in the 80s. Here I am in 2017 cleaning it up. So no, I'm not happy. My only regret is that my older sister isn't alive to go beat my brother to death for doing all of this. But that's a story for another day. There is no water. They can get 1,700 feet a year, they think, from Nichols for 20 years. There's no, they get first option to refuse in 20 years if Nichols has any water to sell again. But the bottom line is they don't have $55 million to pay for this water. which I guess they'll just raise rate. They had no, when he brought it in front of the board, he says, well, you know, we can cut a check to pay for the first down payment, but we have no money to pay for it. The Pass Water Agency is just a broker. They don't actually, you know, they're not water distributors. So they need the water districts to pay for it. And how do water districts get money to pay for $55 million worth of water for 15 million connections? They have to raise water rates. These people are poor. This is not Palm Springs. People live in this section of the high desert because it's really cheap housing, because they're really poor. That's why they live there. They will not be able to afford $500 water bills. They just can't. His other two options for getting water to that area is the California Water Fix, who he says is going to be done in a year or two. Is that going to happen in a year or two, those tunnels? No. His other one is the Sites Reservoir Project that's been going on since the 80s. Over $55 million has been blown on the Sites Water Project, and they have never even done a plan. It's considering that Orville Dam is having problems, it's not likely they're going to build another dam any near soon. And the problem is bigger, that Jeff Davies says, well, the water districts will just go it alone if they can't get state and federal fundings, which is big talk when it's somebody else's money. Water districts do not actually have any revenue except for taxpayers. But it all goes back down to the 2004 adjudication of the Beaumont Basin. This is Joe Akufi. This is the former city attorney of Beaumont, the former legal counsel of Stoma. This is the orchestrator of the Beaumont Basin. Let me tell you, his wife left him in jail. He's lost his license. He'll never practice law again. And he's been indicted for fraud and embezzlement. His wife is an elementary school principal. She left him in jail. The county had to beg her to come for him, lower his bond down twice. She showed up with her lawyer. This is who y'all counting on. Let me tell you, 6 months into doing these books, I said to Judy, these guys got to be on drugs. This is crazy stuff what they did. Crazy stuff. Not legal, crazy. Look at him. Does he look like he's straight? Let me tell you, I never seen a man so happy to be in jail in his life. 7 people indicted, 6 of them say, I drag it out. Joe Akufi says, let's go. I just soon go. He wants to go to prison because he likes it. For some reason, Joe Akufi's happy to go to prison. That's how much on drugs he is. This is your lawyer that you're counting on. This is a lawyer that did the adjudication of the Beaumont Basin, that has drained that basin. This is the lawyer that set up all those bonds, $300 million in fraudulent bonds. This is who it is. You take a good look at him. Does he look like an honorable man? Or does he look like somebody that got caught behind the Denny's doing perverted things? Think about it. This is who he is. This is who you're counting on.
Thank you.
Here, Loffer.
All right. Mr. Cross?
Good morning, Madam Chair, board members. Mark Krause with Pacific Gas and Electric. I just wanted to come and thank you all, as well as your staff in particular.
Thank you?
Thank you.
Oh, my goodness.
For the work you've been doing with our California Hydro Reform Coalition. And you'll see I wanted to call out to you in the Executive
thank you for
Director's
that.
report. On page 12 today, there is, for the first time, a list of all of the backlog projects, which we greatly appreciate. We did not have to drag out a staff. Staff volunteered to do this. We love that. They also volunteered that if any project were to slip, there's an estimated delivery date for each of those projects. If any project were to slip, that date will be stricken and the new date shown, cumulatively, so you can get a sense of how much projects are slipping. I think
Like
that
a regular
shows
critical path chart?
incredible goodwill on your staff's part. And our main point is, we know they're trying. We want to see if we need to devote more resources to this, what the cause of the backlog is. These are projects, as I think you all know, but I'll make the comment for the public as well, that in most cases result, when the license is issued, in reduced generation for all these hydro projects. Yet you see the utilities here saying, no, we want it sooner because we've got incredible costs to get through this process that are being accrued. and that's accruing additional interest to ratepayers and others. So we really want to improve the project. We know your staff does as well, and we thank you for that addition to the executive director's report. Thank you very much for the new hire in that unit as well. Anne Marie, seems like she's going to be wonderful, so thank you. Great progress.
Thank you for the coalition on all sides of this that has come in very constructively to talk about it and help us brainstorm ways to move things more quickly. So I appreciate that as well. It takes two or three or
As far as I know,
four.
in this whole process, I'm the only one who's crazy. So thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, next we have the minutes from the August 1st and 2nd board meeting. Are there any additions or corrections? You were absent, so we can't pass the minutes.
Actually, there is a quorum of the board present, and you can pass the minutes on a 2-0 if the board wants to proceed. If you guys split, this will have to be continued to a future
this
meeting.
meeting town. So they looked okay to me. What do you think? You have to make the motion.
Well, I make a motion to adopt the minutes.
All right, I'll step outside the chair and second it. All in favor? Aye. Okay, they carry. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Okay.
That could have been a tricky one.
I know, really, I got nervous. All right, item number 2. Welcome back.
Thank you so much. Good morning, board members, staff, and the public at large. My name is Kyle Oceandusko, and I'm a senior water resource control engineer within the Division of Water Rights. With me today is Mr. Kenneth Emanuel, also from the Division of Water Rights, and we're here to present item number 2, the hydrology update for the Bay Delta watershed. Looking at precipitation in our state in 3 general blocks in the Northern Sierra, we haven't had any appreciable precipitation in the last 2 weeks or so. A record year with the dark blue line of 94.3 inches. In the Central Sierra, trending towards record, holding at 71.5 inches year to date. Water year to date, excuse me. And in the Southern Basin, not a record for precipitation, but still outstanding, and in light of the last couple of years, wonderful news for California's hydraulic picture. And sorry, there's a clipping error on this slide here. We have 46.1 inches year to date. Unfortunately, that number got clipped off. Here's a quick look at the major reservoirs throughout California, seeing blue across the board, and understanding that there are some operational issues going on right now at Oroville. But in general, things are looking good, especially for this time of year, and it appears that there is sufficient water and the reservoirs are sufficiently full at this time. And our +2. We have Kachuma Reservoir, which is currently at 46% of capacity or 59% of average, and Diamond Valley Lake is about 87% of capacity at this time. As to be expected in this time of year, in August in California, Southern California is showing drought effects, while Northern California at this time is not under drought conditions. We're not seeing any anomalies at this time or anything abnormal that we've seen year to date. And as this slide succinctly concludes, this is, concludes our presentation, but we're available for any questions that the board may have.
Great. Question?
Thank you for your time.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks for staying on it. It's important to spend as much time seeing those blue bars as we did not seeing them for several years, so call it a drought hangover. Terrific, item number 3. Morning. Morning.
Good morning,
Yeah, that's
Chairman
better.
Marcus. Good to do this again. My name is Michael Jurdy. I'm a staff member of the Ocean Standards Unit in the Division of Water Quality, and we're here today to talk about our proposed amendment to the once-through cooling policy for the Encina Power Station. We've had this here before, and so we can make this relatively brief, but please feel free if you have questions to let me know. The once-through cooling policy actually is a shorter name for the water quality control policy on the use of coastal and estuarine waters for power plant cooling. Obviously, that's why we like to call it once-through cooling or the OTC policy. This policy required the reduction of once-through cooling water by power plants by 93% or more. This impacted 19 coastal power plants which used once-through cooling. Currently, 8 have met that requirement and 11 still remain. This was implemented through a series of plans on how to adjust the plants themselves to meet the once-through cooling policy, and these plans stretch from 2010 to 2029. Also part of the policy was the formation of the SWRCB committee, the statewide advisory committee on cooling water intake structures, and you've seen them here many times before, and they were set up as an agency of all the California related agencies, the Coastal Commission, Public Utilities Commission, Energy Commission, State Lands Commission, Air Resources Board, the Independent System Operator, and the Water Board to make sure that every year we review and make sure the grid is still reliable as we implement our once-through cooling policy. We can make this pretty quick here. Our amendment is simply to extend the once-through cooling compliance date for the Encina Power Station units 2 through 5 from the end of this year, December 31st, 2017, until December 31st, 2018. While we've gone through public comments, meetings with the State Water Board here twice this year already with regard to this policy, the SWRCB also met 2 times and we have recommendations. We have gone out with the staff report and brought in public comments. We had 2 comment letters, and I just wanted to highlight some of the prominent comments because they've been brought up several times in the issues that have been brought before the board already. Cogentrix submitted a letter. They are an independent power producer with 98 megawatts of non-once-through cooling power in San Diego County. They have participated in several of the meetings and made their comments known. They submitted another comment letter officially to our amendment, and they noted that they do not oppose the OTC extension for Encina, but they request that non-OTC power generators be used to reduce the need for OTC Encina power during 2018. So they wanted to use those first. And our response are, when SWRCB and their energy agencies did all of their analysis for the facilities, they included the Cogentrix plants and still felt a need to recommend that we extend the Encina deadline as a prudent option to ensure grid reliability. And then the second point is really the allocation and procurement of power capacity itself during 2018 is actually subject to the California Public Utility Commission resource adequacy process and the Cal ISO, or the Independent System Operator contracting process, and is not actually part of our amendment.
Nor is it part of our authority to.
Just imagine if they let us get our hands on that.
That's true.
You're making the crowd nervous.
Cogentrix also.
What?
You're making the crowd nervous.
I'm only joking.
And Cogentrix also requested that Encina, if we're going to extend the year operation, install variable speed pumps to the intake water system.
to reduce once-through cooling impacts. And our response is really NRG, the owner-operator of Encina, has actually chosen to meet our compliance deadline by repowering and closing down the Encina plant. And the extension wasn't requested by NRG, but has been requested by our energy agencies, CAISO, Public Utilities Commission, and CEC, to ensure grid reliability. And the one-year extension should not require actually the installation of the variable speed pumps, because NRG already has the intention to eliminate all OTC at the end of 2018. And in addition, and finally, our interim mitigation payments will be set up, and that process is set up to actually address the impacts itself during the, before final compliance.
I appreciate the comment and the thinking that, what belt and suspenders and other things we can do, to mitigate the extension and its impacts on marine life. And however, from the civil engineering standpoint, just replacing pumps is easier said than done in terms of, the procurement process, competitive bids, construction timeline. In my mind, I may be wrong, but it seems to me that would exceed 1 year in terms of.
And we're proposing only a one-year extension for grid reliability.
So I think the timeline is a big issue here in terms of what can feasibly be installed.
And variable speed pumps, as well as other structural controls, are actually part of what would be the track 2 or other alternative method of compliance. And Encina has chosen track 1 to actually comply.
Thank you.
We're not looking to ask them to do more. The other comment was by the Coastkeeper Alliance, which is NRDC, Heal the Bay, San Diego Coastkeeper, and the Surfrider Foundation. This time got together for their comments. They also do not impose the one-year extension. However, they wanted an explicit statement in the record that Encina will not continue to intake seawater for the Poseidon Carlsbad Desalinization Project, or the Poseidon Project, after the Carlsbad Energy Center becomes operational. And the Carlsbad Energy Center is the replacement non-once-through cooling power plant that NRG is building on site, and that got delayed, which led to the extension that we're looking for today. It's a power plant replacement, so they're repowering approach. And our response is that we don't need to put an explicit statement in our amendment, that the Poseidon desalinization plant is currently authorized to withdraw additional source water that more than required, when it's more than required by Encina, by the San Diego Water Board. They've done an order in process, and that San Diego Water Board is also in the process of drafting a specific NPDES permit for permanent standalone operations of the Poseidon plant. And so it's actually a very separate process from our process here for the Encina amendment. So staff recommends that we adopt the Encina Power Station amendment to the once-through cooling policy to extend the compliance date from December 31st, 2017 to December 31st, 2018 on the 2 remaining units, or the 4 remaining units, units 2 through 5. Unit 1 was actually already shut down in March 1st to begin construction for the Encina Energy Center, which began in April and should end in fourth quarter 2018 and be ready to replace the power of the once-through cooling Encina power plant. And that makes the end of my short presentation. I put my name on there, but obviously everyone has been very involved and predate me. And thank you, Marley, for her long-term service in this area, and Mariella.
Great. We have one speaker, but do you want to ask a question first, or either of you?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
For context, you mentioned 8 out of 19 facilities are in compliance with the OTC policy as of this date, but many on track. And this is an extension request. Is this the first extension request since the OTC policy has, or what's the track record in terms of extensions?
I can jump in on
I was
that.
going to say, it depends on how you count it. Yeah.
So from the original amendment, there was an additional extension request for this LA DWP to modify their compliance schedule The board considered that, in relation to other issues they were doing for renewables and for getting off of coal, and made a modification that did extend the dates. But aside from that, this is the first.
Yeah, and also many have exceeded the requirements for their schedule. So
Yeah, they
there's
retired
sort of
early.
Give and take. So really, this is somewhat exceptional compared to the other 19 or 18 facilities.
Yeah, we've gone from 16 billion gallons a day of permitted withdrawals through once-through cooling to an actual use of about 4 billion gallons a day, and hoping to get that down, obviously, by 2029 to about zero.
Yeah, and thank you for pointing that out, because that's a great measurable indicator of the progress under this policy and the success of it. And also, I would just like to thank our fellow state agencies and the utilities for working with us so cooperatively and effectively in the SACWIS project.
Yeah, it's made a huge difference to ensure grid reliability.
Thank you.
Right. Actually, the collaborative spirit and what you all put together way before all of our time in terms of the SACWIS and having the oversight and the conversations and all that is helpful. I think, you also have the large-scale nuclear going out, which that's a lot of gallons as well in the future phase out. So there's a big workload that we anticipated having in front of the board that we do not, and we're not really sad about that. So I'm happy that it's going as well as it is, because we have enough on our plate.
Yeah, and we're here for this plant in northern San Diego County partially because SONGS shut down early.
Correct.
And has created a
Full.
closer need to monitor energy and to make sure we have enough to meet peak loads during the year.
No, good work. Well, we have a speaker from Cogentrix, Mr. Blue, Greg Blue. Please join us.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Good morning, board members. My name is Greg Blue. I'm with Cogentrix Energy. And as staff relayed, we have participated in this process from the beginning, both as SACWIS and here at the Water Board. We initially opposed this extension, but as you can see in our letter we filed now, we do not oppose it, but that letter was written, we did not oppose it, but we also asked for 2 conditions to be added on, as we saw. And unfortunately, staff chose not to adopt any of those conditions or proposals or suggestions. So our support, I'm not sure exactly where our support is, but what I will say is if you do extend it, we think that you should be clear that this is a one-time only extension, for one thing. And I don't know if the regs say that. I thought they did. I thought I read them somewhere, but nonetheless, this is a one-time only extension. So that's our recommendation. And in closing, I do want to add one observation from the market. To me, it looks like to Cogentrix, it looks like you're basically having a party and nobody's going to come. And what I mean by that is, and I know procurement is not under your authority, but right now, about a couple of months ago, San Diego Gas and Electric filed with the Public Utilities Commission to remove Encina from the list of plants eligible to provide reliability for 2018. The PUC complied with that request. San Diego Gas and Electric has also filed at the PUC for their intent to buy their reliability power for 2018, the resource adequacy power, from a power plant in Mexico. Okay, so that's one buyer. The only other buyer of this power is the California ISO. In order for the ISO to buy this power, they would have to enter into a reliability must-run contract, an RMR contract, kind of a one-year contract. And for that, their board would have to approve them to enter negotiations, and that contract would have to be filed at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And that whole time period, it's a time period to make that happen. To date, we've seen no indication from the ISO that they're going to procure this power. So we're wondering why we're doing all this if nobody's actually going to buy the power. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Johns. Craig Johns, Poseidon Water, on behalf of Poseidon Water Resources.
Thank you, and good morning, Madam Chair and board members. My name is Craig Johns. I'm here today for Poseidon Water, and I'll be very brief. Poseidon has asked me to come and state that it fully supports the staff recommendation as is, and urge the board's adoption of the item today. As you know, from a variety of briefings and so forth over the last several months. No one is more interested in moving the re-permitting process more quickly than Poseidon, and as fast as we can get through the process at the regional board, Poseidon will do so.
Great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. John. Any questions or comments?
When it comes to the potential need to further extend the deadline, does staff have any comment as to if that's going to be anticipated or not?
We actually have members from CalISO, Neil Miller, the director, and I don't know if we want to have their comments in terms of their contracting for the Encina Power.
Well, I would think the question is whether you have a comment. For me, the question is, do we tie our hands if they need extra? It doesn't make, it's sort of premature.
This is Phil
Strikes
Crater
me.
from DWQ, and I'll jump in on that one. The framework for this is that the SACWIS will evaluate on a year-to-year basis whether or not there's a need for an extension, and should there be a need, the SACWIS will weigh in and recommend that you consider an extension. At this point in time, I think that the SACWIS feels that this is an adequate extension through 2018 that should address the need. Should something unforeseen come up, we will have to go through the process again, and that would include the staff report and potentially CEQA, depending on what it is. So there's safeguards in place from just sort of continually extending. Does that address your question? Yeah, I think that does for me.
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, and what's interesting is this comes up in a lot of our permit questions. There's a capacity that's permitted, and then what actually happens may be different than what we permit. And so a year from now, or as we may have to consider this again, we'll be able to, have the hindsight to see what the market, how it took advantage of Encina's capacity and what the overall need is. And of course, relying on ISO and SACWIS to advise us on how critical this infrastructure is. I see it as a safety net in some regard with respect to grid reliability, and that we want to find a good balance on marine protection versus some insurance policy for grid reliability. So I don't think the policy ties our hands as far as having only one extension allowed. I don't know if John, you want to weigh in, or
Well,
Michael?
just in general, there are certain processes that are baked into the policy that allow quicker extensions. And the reality is the board did not, by design, tie its hands because of the grid reliability issue. If somebody was going to make a compelling case for grid reliability and come back to the board needs some flexibility to address that. And I think even if the board were to put in those kinds of restrictions, as at least I think board members Moore and Marcus have heard me say before, these planning documents are organic documents that can change over time. So the board could even change that process in the future if it wanted to, if it had substantial evidence and reason to support it. The reality was we thought it was good policy to put in expedited processes, but we've not tied the future board's hands to address real grid reliability issues consistent with the SACWIS process that we have in place.
It's interesting, I think, looking at it in hindsight, and I know that you all did 8 zillion, 11, 14 motions to get this policy passed, which is really 18, a big one, but the one portion I spent a fair amount of time on is this one, only because we were worried when songs went out that we were going to have a much bigger set of issues. And I think it's fairly brilliant how you came up with this, not just SACWIS in general, but all 3 energy agencies had to say something was necessary in order to get an extension. And we've been very clear that you can't just all agree that you never liked it in the first place. And none of that has happened. I mean, people have really moved together, including the industry, to move this policy forward and repower a lot of these facilities in a way that I don't think at the time the policy was being debated. It was very hard fought and a lot of fears, and it's been impressive how smoothly it's gone, in part, I think, because of all, I'm looking at you, John, because you were right there, because of all the procedures that you all thought through in advance. So I hope somebody's taking notes and writing about this one. It's a good public policy case study. Which doesn't mean we won't have any burps along the way, but. Any other questions, comments? Do I have a motion?
I would like to move adoption of staff recommendation with the change sheet.
Second.
Great. Any other discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Ayes carry. Thank you very much. All right. We are on, looking forward to this, two really interesting informational items. Speaking of things that are going surprisingly well, with a lot of credit for folks all around, but still a lot of work to be done on everybody's part. An update on Sigma with our staff presenting jointly with the Department of Water Resources.
All right, now that we're all official, we'll get things started. Good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. My name is Eric Ekdahl. I'm the Director for the Office of Research, Planning, and Performance at the State Water Board. With me, I have a number of guests today. To my immediate left is Taryn Ravazzini. She is the executive sponsor for Sigma at the Department of Water Resources. Then I have Sam Bolin-Bryan. He's the program manager for the Groundwater Management Unit at the State Water Board. I have Trevor Joseph, a program manager and supervising engineering geologist at the Department of Water Resources, and Mark Norberg, a senior engineering geologist who's been integral in the Sigma process over at the department as well. Today, we have recently passed a milestone for Sigma with the first public deadline for local public agencies in the formation of groundwater sustainability agencies passing on July 1st, 2017. With that passage and then the kind of implementation or the setup for the first stage of possible board action, we thought this would be a good time to come before the board and talk about what we've done both with the department or as the department and as the working together with the water board and looking at what we've done over those 3 years since Sigma was passed in 2014 and looking forward to what we have to do next. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Taryn, who I believe has a couple of high-level statements. And then with that, we'll turn it over to Trevor, who will run through about 15 minutes or so worth of descriptions of what's been going on over at the department as they went through 3 years of intensive rulemaking processes and really firing up their technical assistance and financial assistance efforts. And then we'll turn it over to Sam after that to look at kind of what's next for the board. So with that, Taryn.
Thank you, Eric, and good morning, board members. It's a pleasure to be here today. Again, my name is Taryn Ravazzini. I'm Deputy Director for Special Initiatives at the Department of Water Resources and the new executive sponsor for the Sigma program within the department. This is a very timely update for you. As Eric mentioned, we're very excited. We met a major milestone on June 30th, July 1st for the formation of the groundwater sustainability agencies. That is very exciting. Staff will go into more detail as to the layout of all of that. But what this does is it takes us into a new and very active phase for the department in terms of Sigma implementation. We will be moving now into the development of groundwater sustainability plans. Again, more detail to come, but this is definitely one of those, as you were saying, successes thus far. One of the slides that Trevor and Mark will be referencing in their presentation is a list of accomplishments to date, and it shows that we've met every single legislative and regulatory related deadline. So we're very, very pleased to be here to be able to say that today. So again, I'm very pleased to be able to rely on the very active and technically savvy staff. But before I go into, before I hand it over to them, I did want to recognize the very strong working relationship that the board and DWR have had through this process, not just in the crafting of the legislation and the resulting regulations, but I really think it shows a level of commitment to come. We have years ahead of us of a lot of work and coordination, so we are committed to that. As I mentioned, interagency coordination, it is important to emphasize the passage of SGMA legislation and those regulations solidified a commitment by the state that groundwater management be locally driven. So while the department has a regulatory role in SGMA, our greatest contribution to successful implementation will be through our role in planning, technical, and financial assistance. And all of this will be to help those GSAs reach sustainability through the preparation of complete and adequate groundwater sustainability plans. So we are really gearing up for that right now. So that concludes my introductory remarks, but again, we're just very pleased to be before you today.
I'd just like to put an exclamation mark on that coordination between the state board staff and DWR. It's been incredible to see. So.
All right, well, excellent. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Trevor Joseph. I'm one of the program managers at the department. Here to present a lot of detail in terms of what we've been achieving the last couple of years, as Taryn pointed out. Before I get into that, though, I would like to just give a very brief overview for the audience and those that have maybe not tracked with us through everything that's been going on. Just an overview slide here that on the left, you can see that there's really kind of 4 entities, if you will, that are engaged in SGMA on a consistent basis. Of course, the department that I work for, we're the regulatory and assisting agency. We do technical evaluations of these new groundwater sustainability plan requirements on the local agencies. The local agencies have the heavy lift. They're the groundwater sustainability agencies. They need to do the planning and implementation, and only if they choose not to or if they cannot find a path to sustainability, then the board or the state Department of Water Resources through a technical evaluation would the board get involved. And of course, the board is the enforcing agency in this relationship, although the board's been doing a lot more than just being the enforcement agency, providing assistance through facilitation and other items that I'm sure Sam will touch on. And then, of course, stakeholders are around this process, and this is very much a stakeholder-driven process, SGMA. And so there's a huge recognition of the stakeholder effort to date and the needed effort on an ongoing basis to make this successful. On the right, at a highest level, sustainability is really the avoidance of these undesirable results, these little icons here that show different conditions that must be avoided at significant and reasonable levels. The local agencies in these high and medium priority basins throughout the state must avoid these undesirable results within 20 years of implementing their plans. And plans are due either in 2020 or 2022. So it's coming up rather rapidly. For the 2020 group, it's those critically overdrafted basins that need to have those plans in place.
I just turned it back on. I am going to make sure that Tam Dota does get to see this because these icons are great.
Oh, thank you.
I just want to say.
Thank you. So the work's really, although we've met these deadlines and the local agencies have written up to meet their deadlines, there's a lot of work to get these plans in place. 2020 is right around the corner, as we know. Oops. So again, as Taryn mentioned, here's just a list of, kind of a partial list of our due dates, a lot of them legislative, and other achievements. Looking back really quickly, 15-16 was a years mainly of developing emergency regulations that were put in place and approved by the California Water Commission. 17 and 18, we've met those legislative due dates that we've needed to meet on best management practices, putting together a Bulletin 118 document that really just kind of memorialized basin boundary changes. But as you can see, we have some boxes that have left to be checked, and we'll talk more about that here in the subsequent slides. That first box that we kind of want to focus on is, although it's checked here, the GSA formation, the status the due date was June 30th, 2017 for those local agencies, as Eric mentioned. Mark Nordberg, one of my staff, working very closely with the board, provided that assistance to local agencies to meet those requirements. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and he's going to take us through some of that information.
Before you begin there, I remember when we were having the hearings before SGMA was passed and all the stakeholders, multiple days of hearings in 2014, it seemed that Bulletin 118 was sort of a flashpoint, but something that was going to be very useful to revisit. And hadn't it been a lot of years since the department felt they had a good chance to really take another look at Bulletin 118? And in your mind, wasn't that a pretty important breakthrough for the state to update that document?
Good memory. Yeah, that's a good question. Bulletin 118-03 was really the last kind of comprehensive document that the department put out. And it really included a variety of useful information for local agencies, some recommendations. It was really kind of a key document for the department at the time. We really haven't pulled together a Bulletin 118 since that time. We've gotten involved in CASGEM and now SGMA. And so we're renewed interest in updating that document and making it a really useful companion for local agencies and stakeholders with groundwater management. The interim document that I just referenced, and why I should have went into this a little bit, but the interim document actually was a very brief document that really just memorialized some basin boundary modifications that we completed last year. But we're looking at creating a comprehensive update, maybe akin to that 2003 version again in the 2020 timeframe. There's other activities that we're doing in terms of technical assistance that I'll go into that are also, I think, value added to local agencies as they start to work on SGMA.
Yeah, and it may seem trivial, but this is really important. You know, as a professional who's dealt with the underground, it's a very mysterious place, and it's very expensive to characterize it accurately. So, you know, the surface water folks kind of have it easy compared to the groundwater, and figuring out, you know, getting a lens in to what's going on underground is very challenging, and so it's hard to get the resources necessary to do a great job to really follow through with our promise to create technical support for local agencies. And so, you know, SGMA helped us tremendously, I think, in terms of getting us a critical mass of resources to revisit this, and we'll have to keep revisiting it. The underground, it changes, and you don't see it until you really have the tools to get in there and investigate, and it's not inexpensive. So thanks for your efforts on that very critical piece.
That was the quote of the day. The pressure's now on. It's a very mysterious place.
Okay. Good morning, board members. My name is Mark Nordberg, and I've been the GSA project manager for the department's SGMA efforts since I started with the SGMA program in January of 2015. You know, I pretty much started on my first day, and Travis said, okay, you're going to manage the GSA component, and we have 6 days to get our first notice posted online. So it was a busy first couple days. So I'll be brief in my statements right now. I'm going to go through a series of 5 slides. We've kind of put together a progression of GSA formation, 6 months by 6 months by 6 months. And you can see that things really did kick off about a year and a half ago. This first slide shows the first 6 months of SGMA implementation, January, February, March, April, May, and June of 2015. And you can see by the first 6 months of SGMA, we had 3 GSAs formed. You know, during this first 6 months, it was a lot of program establishment, you know, outreaching to local agencies, you know, lots of development of educational materials, fact sheets, you know, to really help, you know, the public, local agencies, as well as our own departments, really understand what the SGMA legislation is and was going to be. So the first 6 months we had 3. Those were the glory days, the good old days. You can see in the next 6 months, we definitely had a progression of GSA formation notifications. You know, and it really, I do want to point to the map. It kind of shows where those first GSAs were formed. You know, Imperial County took up basically claimed the entire county, all the alluvial basins within the county. a lot of local agencies were starting to form GSAs in Northern California. And I do want to add that SGMA had definitely a details on how GSAs should be formed, who should form GSAs. In the initial several months of SGMA implementation, local agencies were starting to form very small areas, small irrigation districts, small water districts. Some of those jurisdictions had some overlap, but the consequences of overlapping GSA formations weren't necessarily spelled out. So at the end, in fall of 2015, SB 13 was one piece of legislation that amended SGMA, and that clarified a lot of the language in SGMA related to GSA formation. It talked about the consequences of overlap and what would happen if two separate local agencies formed GSAs and had overlap. And I know Sam can talk more about what those consequences are right now. So by the end of 2015, we were up to about 39 GSA formation notifications. The next 6 months, we were up to 73. Some of the notifications were starting to get formed in the San Joaquin Valley. And I do want to add as well, during this time, while a lot of local agencies did submit notifications, a lot of folks did outreach to both the department and the State Water Board to receive facilitation support services. So both of our entities had contracts with facilitators who definitely wanted help kind of organizing some of this difficult governance structure. So despite the fact, in the next couple slides there will still be holes, you can see by the fifth screenshot of this, we pretty much have 99% coverage, if not more, throughout the state. So by the middle of 2016, we were up to 73 GSA notifications, up to 104 by the end of 2016. And you can see that those last 6 months, the January through June of this year, we had a lot of GSA formation activity. So I could go on and on. In fact, I've been known to do so with respect to this topic, but I can turn it back to Trevor and can answer any questions you might have.
Well, I would love to go on and on. I relate to you on that point. I resemble that remark. This is it's an excellent slide and very great presentation you just made on this unfolding and those dynamics of overlap and fragmentation and then coalescing of governance to a certain scale in certain areas. Very important part of this. I guess I want to point out, to me, sustainable isn't just the water resource part of it, but it's also the institutional part. Is it a sustainable institutional structure to form GSPs, to form groundwater sustainability plans that meet the requirements of the law? So you have an institutional sustainability, and then you have a fiscal sustainability. Are these structures, institutions, and management organizations at this basin scales fiscally sustainable? I think we'll be all together looking at that as this unfolds and the hard work goes forward in the next couple of years. And so remind me, isn't it true that we have 127 medium and high priority basins, and that now we have 293 institutions that are proposed to manage them?
That's correct. So when the basins were first reprioritized, there was 127 high and medium priority basins. Those are the basins subject to SGMA. We had, without going into all the details, 22 of those basins have submitted alternative plans. And as Sam may point out, because an alternative was submitted in compliance with SGMA, a GSA doesn't necessarily have to be formed in those basins unless the department does not approve that alternative. So of those 22 alternatives, and I know Trevor will go into some of these details later, I think 11 of those basins do not have any GSAs. 11 of those basins have full GSA coverage, and 9 of those basins don't have any GSA coverage, and 2 have partial. So if the department does not approve an alternative, there will be some additional GSAs formed in those particular basins. Of the basins right now that do have GSAs, there's 140 basins. 108 of those are high and medium priority basins. Again, some of the alternatives take up the rest of those. And there's adjudicated basins as well. In those portions of a basin that are adjudicated, they have their own reporting requirements. And as Sam will likely talk about, it's the fringe areas of those adjudicated basins that are having a lack of GSA coverage. So I do want to point out that though there's, of the 108 basins that are high and medium priority that do have GSAs, there's also 32 low and very low priority basins that have some sort of GSA coverage.
Thank you. The discussion will continue.
That's good. Thank you.
And I think for folks at home and otherwise that are watching, it might be helpful to, when you look at the number 293 GSA basins, seems like quite a lot. But we have, 430 some odd delineated groundwater basins in the state?
517.
Okay, so.
There you go.
So I think it, for folks to understand, it kind of speaks to really the complex hydrology that we're dealing with in our state, and not necessarily just kind of a.
And I do want to add this number 293. It's a little. There could be less. Some a local agency, be it a county or a city or an irrigation district, a water agency, they might be part of many GSAs. A jurisdictional area for a particular local agency might span several groundwater basins. So they might be part of different efforts, and they're kind of, maybe counted a couple times.
That's helpful. Good.
Might also be a good segue to, Mark mentioned alternatives and adjudicated basins. The adjudicated basins are shown with the kind of the hash mark there on that map. Again, they don't have to have, those adjudicated areas, I should say, don't need to have that GSA coverage. The next slide here just shows the alternatives that we received by January 1st, 2017. So a reminder that this is an option in the statute for local agencies that feel that they are largely sustainable to submit either an existing groundwater management plan or do an analysis that shows that they're already sustainable in lieu of completing a groundwater sustainability agency or forming a GSA and preparing a GSP. So as Mark mentioned, we received about 22 alternatives overlying these basins shown in blue by January 1st, 2017. We're in the process of reviewing those alternative submittals right now. It's important to kind of remind folks out there that, and we have before they were submitted, that the same criteria applies in our review of these alternatives as a GSP. The same end goal, of course, is basin-wide sustainability and the avoidance of undesirable results. So these entities are claiming, again, that they have a plan in place or the analysis itself to show that they can reach sustainability. And so it'll be a high bar, but we will provide some status updates hopefully early next year.
Yeah, and as we look at this map, we know the managers, the professionals that have been, and agencies have been working for decades to achieve sustainable groundwater management. And so this shows that SIGMA can accommodate an equivalent process that SIGMA envisions for other areas that may not be reaching all the definitions of sustainability. So a necessary component of the law to really recognize the great efforts, the visionary efforts of many in our state that have already been accomplished.
That's exactly right. And actually that's the term we used, functional equivalency, where some of their concepts and their ways to meet the requirements are slightly different, but can be functionally equivalent to the requirements of the regulations. Again, here's our icons. I didn't know they would be popular, so I can't say that
We just have a tendency to note them, and occasionally in some of our hearings, they become controversial, believe it or not.
But
this is a very calm day for us, I have to say. I'm almost confused, but delighted.
We're happy to be here today. Then.
I'm glad you're here. You're making it good.
Again, my point with this slide was, again, the same standards apply, and the avoidance of these 6 items is key, regardless of an alternative or a groundwater sustainability plan.
It's a good slide.
So now kind of transitioning to, as Taryn mentioned, our next steps here is really revolving around providing that assistance to these local agencies and GSAs in preparation of their groundwater sustainability plans. And we really kind of have 3 groupings of assistance: our financial assistance program, our planning assistance, and our technical assistance. Again, all pointing to hopefully a goal of having local agencies be able to prepare compliant groundwater sustainability plans. So kind of one at a time, and I apologize for a lot of text here, but the financial assistance program, the department received $100 million to award to local agencies as part of Prop 1 for groundwater management. We did an early round of a limited amount of money for counties but the vast majority of the money remains in a second round that we're nearing completion on putting that instructions out in a final form for local agencies, again, to really work on completing groundwater sustainability plans. As the draft solicitation instructions are currently written, it is confined to these GSAs, with the exception of areas where there are severely disadvantaged communities. It's a much broader eligibility list, and we have to award at least 10 million of this 100 million for severely disadvantaged communities. A lot of detail here. Technical and planning assistance. The purpose of this slide is really to kind of articulate the actual cyclical process as opposed to some of the details. So let me kind of walk you through this briefly. One, the first phase, if you will, was that GSA formation and governance. Again, largely complete. That is a done activity. Phase 2 is assistance and engagement, again, leading up to the development and submission of GSPs to the department. There's kind of dual tracks here. We have a lot of outreach that the department provides, and we can provide then facilitation services. We mentioned that we provided that for the development of these GSAs, but we're continuing that program for all the stakeholder engagement activities as it relates to local agencies having to develop their groundwater sustainability plans. So that's kind of shown on the far left green box. But we're also going to provide technical services, specifically engagement and field activities or support in a technical manner to local agencies, GSAs, so they can achieve more of the technical elements of their plan. Part of that technical assistance, though, is also in the blue boxes there, the guidance, data, and tools. And I'm going to go into that in a little more detail. As you pointed out, Bulletin 118, our best management practice documents, there's a variety of tools and activities in that grouping that we plan to provide to aid local agencies in development of plans. Again,
on the technical assistance, you're also probably leveraging, those who have been there before in our state in terms of institutional structures that are successful in certain areas and teaching the new the folks for which this is new to them.
Yeah, and a lot of that, there's think tank groups out there like Water Foundation and others that have also been really cutting edge in providing that kind of wiki of available tools and methods to provide local agencies opportunities to see different ways that others have met these requirements. So we're working closely with others in that process as well. But then, we get to a GSP evaluation phase, and then we'll work into a final phase of implementation. But as the Act requires 5-year updates of these plans and annual reports, that this will be a cyclical process of us looking at this information, updating data and information as we obtain it. So this is really just kind of the technical assistance in the red box elements of this process. So one slide here on planning assistance. Hong Lin in our audience is leading that planning assistance and engagement efforts. We do the aforementioned facilitation, very successful program on the GSA side, and we're continuing to do that as I mentioned. We also are lining ourselves for a lot of engagement with our regional offices. This map depicts the 4 regions that are in our Division of Integrated Regional Water Management program. And we have regional coordinators, and we're all aligning also staff to be representative of each basin point of contact so that we have a go-to person there, and plan to have very meaningful meetings with these entities on a basin scale in the future as part of this engagement. So a lot of work there on our planning assistance. Just a couple of slides on technical assistance. I briefly mentioned our best management practice. This was a legislative requirement. We met that in terms of providing the 5 best management practices you see in the bottom left there by our legislative deadline. These were largely technical documents, that really go into the technical requirements of developing a groundwater sustainability plan. We designed them in such a way that they really kind of speak to a plan requirement, or they're structured in such a way that you see the plan requirement in the statute, and then there's different ways to achieve it. So we're hoping that they're really value added for local agencies. We also do a series of guidance documents that we felt weren't quite in the technical umbrella, but you can see those here in the orange box. Everything from checklists. Most recently, we put out draft guidance documents on how tribal governments would like to be engaged in the process, as well as a really elaborate tools for communication and engagement. Again, a very critical element of SGMA that's unique from other prior groundwater management efforts. And so that's an important key document for local agencies. I did want to mention real quickly that we're putting together a BMP right now, working closely with stakeholders soon on the sustainable management criteria. What that is it's a requirement in the regulations to address and define what are undesirable results by basin. Very critical that those elements are achieved in these groundwater sustainability plans for us to approve them. And so we really want to make sure local agencies understand those requirements clearly, and we hope this BMP will provide them that information.
Good. I can't help but just mention, I wonder if bankruptcy is an undesirable outcome, you know? Because, you know, we look at this water resource side of it all, but when we talk about sustainable management, you have to have sustainable institutional frameworks.
Yeah, and that, you know, there are requirements in the regulations in the statute for the local agencies to explain, you know, their financial structure, their management structure to the department. So it is an element that we put in the regulations. But you're right, this is a huge lift for the local agencies. You know, the grant money is just seed money. They're going to need to develop the appropriate structure so that they can manage this in perpetuity, really. So last slide on technical assistance. I apologize. I know you can't really see those images, but this is an example of some of the tools that we developed. And so real quickly, some of them were existing, and we've just modified them and tried to enhance them to make them more user-friendly for SGMA. The first one is our Groundwater Information Center. A lot of groundwater level and subsidence data on this tool currently. Hopefully we can expand that to address some of the other undesirable result data sets. Water management tool, this tool really focuses on boundaries, existing IRWM boundaries, water agency boundaries, county boundaries, existing groundwater management plans. It's been a really valuable tool for local agencies in their GSA formation to click on layers and kind of look at different governance layers throughout the basins. The disadvantaged community tool, hugely important for our grant program and for local agencies who are and others who are looking for grant dollars as it relates to the disadvantaged community opportunities. And then finally, our basin boundary tool there, number 4, really provides geologic information so that local agencies in hopes of making some basin boundary, maybe modifications, can use that tool to ensure that they understand where those boundaries reside. Again, we plan more tools in the future to aid in SGMA implementation.
Please work on tablets. My commute is now shot. It'd be fun, though. I'm assuming it does. So it's just for folks who are listening who may not be able to see the screen. So the site they go to is gis.water.cad.gov to find this cornucopia of cool stuff.
Yes, and if I can do it, anybody can do it because I'm not a GIS person. And so it's a really user-friendly tool. Just click the box, and actually you can also highlight the shapefiles or click on the shapefiles, and then all the data is embedded in that shapefile. There's a little drop-down menu, so it'll show you the county contacts, the existing groundwater management plans. In many cases, there's a link to it just by clicking on the shapefiles.
That's great. Sorry.
Oh yeah, and just another recognition of the basin boundary tool. Again, in the underground basins, the more we look, the more we learn, and this enables us to make adjustments not just technically, but even, in terms of how we manage these basins and governance decisions, and having a tool like this and being able to input information will be important for this element, just to stay current and relevant and based on what we learn.
One final item, this is our Sigma portal. This is really the kind of a one-stop shop, hopefully easy use location for GSAs and local agencies to find all the documents that have been submitted to the department related to Sigma obligations. So you can see the little icons there. The icons take you to the GSA formation information. We don't have GSPs quite yet, but the GSP submittal tool will be obviously the place where local agencies upload their groundwater sustainability plans. The alternatives that I referenced can be located there. Adjudicated basins, requirement in the act that those adjudicated basin information be provided to the state, that is located there. And then the aforementioned, basin boundary information. So this is really our portal, obviously, to all of this information. We continually try to tweak this and make improvements, especially as it relates to the GSP information. We're about to get a lot of information when folks start to send us plans. So this will be enhanced to accommodate all that info. So one final slide. Again, just kind of in summary, next steps. We're really engaged in implementing our assistance programs as part of this next phase, as you probably can see. We'll continue to develop our technical tools. There's a lot of things I kind of quickly skimmed over or didn't mention at all today that we're working on. Heavily vested in engaging with public and GSAs during this process. We want to make sure, again, that hopefully they can develop successful GSPs. We're working through that process of evaluation of alternatives, which I think a lot of local agencies will be really interested in terms of where we come out on some of these alternatives. And I think it will help give them a better sense of really, where the requirements are on the groundwater sustainability plans in the future. And then we look forward to continuing coordinating with those local agencies and the state board. It has been a very collaborative process, and in large part we're successful today because we worked very closely together. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is great, and looking ahead, and thank you for your leadership at the department. It's been exemplary, and the working with us and the stakeholders it's just a real success. So thank you for your efforts. Looking ahead, now we have the GSA process at a milestone, and as we form GSPs, do you see some cases where one GSP will need to be participated? Well, there will be several GSAs participating in one GSP, or GSA participating in more than one GSP. Those kind of complexities, but given that groundwater is complex, it's understandable to a certain extent.
We're getting a better picture of that. Hong, who's in the regional offices doing that engagement, are starting to keep tabs on what the formation is, what it's going to look like. Initially, we thought we may get 200 plus groundwater sustainability plans. Again, there's just over 127 high and medium priority basins that need to comply. Some of them, may be approved alternatives, but the remainder have to prepare groundwater sustainability plans. And we thought, okay, well, maybe we're going to get a flood of them. Now it's looking like we may receive less than that, meaning that Sigma allows for multiple GSAs to form in a basin and prepare multiple plans with a coordination agreement. But we're starting to, I think, see that change a little bit, and I think some local agencies are seeing some advantages to preparing maybe one plan per basin, still with maybe multiple GSAs. And there may be some economies in scale in doing that. Again, it's up to the local agencies how they want to approach it. The law gives them that flexibility. But we, to be honest, we don't know exactly yet. It's kind of a changing, continuously evolving and changing number.
Yeah, no, thank you. Great answer. And it reminds me of, when you're making pasta and you put the olive oil in and you get a whole bunch of bubbles and they start to coalesce, there's a dynamic visual there in terms of how this may evolve. And it's relevant metaphor because, the liquid, the water.
That's a good one. I like that.
The oil.
Just olive oil.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, so my name is Sam Bolenbryan. I'm the manager of the board's groundwater management program. I'm going to touch on a couple of things that have already been lightly referenced already, which I think is a testament to how well coordinated we are, that we know each other's points inside and out by this time.
That's good.
But what I'm really going to talk about is the status of the GSA formation. To not bury the lead, to get right to it, the GSA formation has been successful. I think that's an important point. It was mentioned earlier and evident in the maps that Mark showed. But I really want to kind of double down on the point that this has been a tremendous amount of effort by local agencies. The Department of Water Resources has provided assistance and made sure kind of the nuts and bolts of the process are there. The board and board staff have worked really hard to make sure there's an appropriate incentive to the process. But really the credit goes to the local agencies that have invested a lot of hours and hours of coordination and stakeholder meetings to kind of get these organizations in place. Kind of getting into the specifics of what this means, managed versus unmanaged areas, I kind of want to break down why are we identifying managed and unmanaged areas at this point, and then also how we got to that. So the reason we are identifying managed and unmanaged areas is that the State Water Board has a role after the June 30th deadline to start collecting extraction reports from groundwater pumpers in areas that are outside of the management of a GSA. And so that's why we're identifying these areas, managed versus unmanaged, is we're determining where areas, we're identifying areas where there may be pumpers that are subject to these new reporting requirements that SWRCB creates. Kind of going into the map a bit here, Trevor made a joke that this is the GSAs by night. But what we're really showing is in the light gray, these are the areas that are managed. And so this gives us a good kind of statewide summary snapshot with only a few kind of color tones of where there are not reporting requirements that the board will be following up on. The way we kind of determine this is combined a lot of the information that is gathered by the Department of Water Resources through the GSA formation process. So groundwater sustainability agencies submit their notices to the department. They also submit mapping data showing the boundaries of their GSAs. And the department is the clearinghouse of that information. And so we took that in addition to identifying which basins have submitted an alternative to the department, as well as the maps of where the adjudicated areas were. And so we kind of combined all of that to create what you're seeing in front of you. It's important to note that this is not a static map by any means. This will be an ongoing process. There are local conditions could change, and so we are definitely kind of keeping an eye on how things proceed. It's also worth pointing out that board staff are still continuing to review the GSA filings. We may find issues that kind of weren't reflected necessarily in the mapping data, but were in the specific GSA filings, such as things like eligibility, or if there are folks that have filed maybe for an area that's larger than their jurisdiction. And really the purpose here is to try and look for areas where there are pumpers subject to these new reporting requirements. And the idea there is that they're either kind of submitting information and under control of a local agency, or they're submitting information to the board so at least someone kind of knows what's going on.
That's an interesting point about, declaring for more than your jurisdiction. But are there cases in our state where maybe there's a LAFCO process that's been spurred on by the SWRCB driver?
Certainly, and there's kind of interesting discussions from the LAFCO side of how SWRCB and LAFCO integrate. But there are a lot of agencies entities forming new local agencies so that those agencies can become groundwater sustainability agencies. And then in other areas, they're working with LAFCO to kind of extend their boundaries. This is a good statewide snapshot of kind of the areas that are managed. It doesn't give a lot of detail on where the unmanaged areas are. So kind of zooming in a little, we're able to zoom into a specific area. And the reason we're able to kind of focus in on a specific area is because, as Mark mentioned, most of the remaining unmanaged areas are in adjudicated basins. And so these areas are referred to as fringes. And the reason they're referred to as this is most of the basin is covered by an existing management structure. And then these kind of remaining fringes were not I think in some cases, local agencies decided it wasn't necessary to form a GSA for these areas because there's limited development there. The other point I wanted to make in this map, you'll notice there are a couple of colors we've added, and this is because we've made a distinction in unmanaged areas into kind of two categories. The first are marked in pink, and these are areas where we think there are extractors. And so I think it's important to notice that our process applies to individual extractors. And so there's not really a lot of value in us kind of focusing on areas where there are clearly no extractors. And so those areas where we don't think there's anyone subject to the reporting requirements, we've marked as green, and we don't really plan to prioritize efforts in those areas. This also allows us a little flexibility to recognize that there are certain parts of the state where maybe there was a clear intent to cover all of the area, but maybe a mismatch in mapping exercises. And so this kind of flags those issues so that local agencies can fix them. But really the areas are so small that there's no pumpers there for us to focus in on, so we are kind of not planning to prioritize it. Kind of breaking down what that looks like in terms of total unmanaged area, it's about a 70-30 split of areas that are either undeveloped and not subject to reporting requirements, or we plan to follow up with. These areas where we think there will be reporting are spread across 12 basins. As I mentioned, most of them are adjudicated, and it's the small fringes that the adjudication didn't cover across 6 counties. All of this information is available on an interactive map on our website, and part of the reason we designed this map this way is to make it really clear to landowners and extractors to help them determine whether or not they are in one of these unmanaged areas and subject to the reporting requirements. Getting a little more into this reporting process, while it's great that the state has been so successful, the board definitely has been planning, recognizing that we are the backup plan in this process, and we've taken that role really seriously. We've defined a process that we think is really scalable, and that was kind of one of the issues that we're facing. One of the questions we get a lot is, how are we going to handle this if we have to do a lot? This is kind of a quick outline of the steps, but we would essentially identify the extractors in unmanaged areas, and that's what we've done. We plan to notify those extractors and let them know about these new kind of reporting obligations that SGMA creates. We'll collect those reports, review them, and then invoice the extractors for the fees associated with the filings. The fees went before you in May as emergency regulations. We have a little technical assistance arrow across the bottom, not to be confused with the Department of Water Resources technical assistance. This is just to indicate our clear intent to help people through the process. We wanted to make it as clear as possible, but also to make sure that compliance was straightforward, and so board staff are planning to help extractors as they work through the reporting process. Getting into the...
That was, by the way, one of the better flow charts I've ever seen. It shows that work's going to get done.
Gears. Getting to that first step a little more, this is a question we received a lot. I think my first day on the job 3 years ago, right around the time SGMA passed, was how are you going to find everyone? We've developed a data-driven approach that is centered around parcels, and it integrates a lot of different data sets to help us identify which parcels we think may have a well. And the idea here is that there isn't really a one-stop shop statewide that is fully comprehensive. So we wanted to kind of do a belt and suspenders approach times 4. We've pulled data from our colleagues in the Division of Drinking Water, Division of Water Rights, the Department of Pesticide Regulation, and then also a lot of useful information from the Department of Water Resources. Kind of lumped it all together with some of our clever staff, and into this algorithm that is highly scalable. And so we could kind of focus on 10 parcels to evaluate, or 10,000 using the same process, and if we needed within a similar time frame. And so that's kind of was our plan if we had to use it. Fortunately, we don't need to, but it is there available now. We'd notify the extractors after we've identified them using that process. They'd then go through the extraction reporting process. They'd have to provide information. They will have to provide information like their well location, the capacity of the well, the volumes of water pumped, and kind of how they're using the water, so the purpose and where that water is being used. These reports have to be filed electronically, and so we have electronic forms available through our website, developed by our Division of Information Technology. It's been working really hard on them. It's another area of coordination. But these electronic forms are kept simple, and so here's kind of an example screenshot of someone will have to log in and then put in their user information and kind of basic pieces. And then also there's a mapping component to the form. And I think this is a big benefit to extractors because the law requires that they provide us information on maps. Typically, in a lot of processes, you would have to hire a consultant to really formalize these maps. We think it's much simpler if they have a web interface that provides the same outcome without having to spend kind of a lot of resources to pull together the information. So we have a map-based interface that's part of the form that does collects the information for where the well is located and then identifies where the water was used.
So this is a system any one of us could use just by pointing and clicking. That's great.
That was the intent, yeah. And it is available for testing now. So if you would like to try clicking it out.
Brad, I get to play.
You have a well in there in Emeryville?
There's probably one, but I don't have one. But, yeah.
So yeah, all of this information, and we developed guides for step-by-step walkthroughs, things like that, for how to use the forms as well, just to make sure compliance was straightforward. Getting a little more into the process, so we may be identifying landowners and noticing those landowners that are not subject to the reporting requirements. This is just kind of inevitable. We can't perfectly identify every well. We just have to use a data-driven approach to get as close as we can. So landowners will receive a notification. They'll create an account online and file their reports. They will be provided the option if they do not think they're subject to the reporting requirements or they just don't own a well and we accidentally sent them a letter. They can notify us and then that will provide kind of an off-ramp from the process. And so that will be kind of one of the more simple forms we have on our website, is just to say, no, I don't have a well, you please don't contact me again. And then we won't. And then finally, once people submit their reports by December 15th, we will issue invoices after that and then collect the fees. This is kind of my final slide. It's just a timeline of how that process plays out. So we have identified the parcels that we think might have a well. We are planning to send letters out to those landowners later this week. The reporting of monthly volumes is by water year. And so while people can start submitting data now, they can't submit a complete report until the close of the water year, which is September 30th. They'll need to provide monthly volumes of water extracted for July, August, and September. The reports are due by December 15th. The very next day, the board staff will be reviewing these reports, and then the fees will be due by February 15th. And so that kind of wraps up the overall process moving forward for the board. As we've clearly mentioned, this process is very focused to a very small area, and the big takeaway point is that the large majority of the state has been successful in the GSA formation process. And I was just going to hand it over to Eric for some closing comments.
Thanks, Sam and Trevor and others. I think that was a really good high-level overview of what we've been doing for the last 3 years. And before closing things off, I did want to touch on a couple of more things just as kind of closing food for thoughts. One, and we've gone to this well a number of times, pun intended, was just to emphasize the coordination between both the department and the State Water Board staff. With Sam and Trevor, both of their groups have really just been tightly integrated. They talk to each other all the time, and I think that's been tremendously important and successful in just making things work as smoothly as they have. And it's paid off. I think we both have a common vision of how Sigma can work if things are implemented correctly. And we're on the way towards helping that become true. There's also, we can't emphasize enough the tremendous success of the locals. I think the coverage is 99.9% of the Sigma eligible basins are covered. We're really only talking about a few number of wells, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but Sam and his staff have been looking at how many wells we actually think might be in these unmanaged areas, and maybe 40, maybe a few more, maybe a few less. We're going to kind of see as it comes in, but it's very, very few number of wells. I mean, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but you consider that there's somewhere between maybe 1 million or 2 million wells in the state of California, and 40 are subject to the Sigma reporting requirements. That's a tremendously successful number. And it goes to the work of the locals mainly, who realized that this was a real thing, and that Sigma was something that they had to look at and address and kind of work towards going forward. With that being said, there's this tremendous success. The hard work still has to come.
Absolutely.
And if we look at what has to be done by February 1st, 2020, which is exactly 900 days from today, when those first sustainability plans are due, the local agencies are going to have to develop their own funding source. They're going to have to kind of do the hydrogeologic assessment of what is going on in their basin. They'll have to develop water budgets. They're going to have to identify pumpers, and in some cases, they're going to have to develop recharge projects or maybe curtail pumping. And those are going to be tremendously challenging and controversial decisions as they go forward. So the locals had to be prepared, but I think also both the department and the water board need to be prepared to help get past some of those controversial issues and to support the efforts of the locals in developing those plans. And if things fall apart, which they very well may do so, even though we hope that they don't, be ready to step in with the intervention process if it's needed. And I think continuing to serve as that credible backstop and threat will help motivate locals, because still their locally developed plan is going to look a whole lot better than whatever we come up with here and impose upon them. I think also just kind of the last little thing to mention is there's an education need. And if we look at drought and kind of the big pictures we saw of the reservoirs and the bathtub rings around them, you could very visually and easily see, wow, this is what happens when we have drought. Look at our water supply. You don't have that easy connection with groundwater. You can't walk up to a well and say, man, look, it's gone down by 600 feet. But there are places in the Central Valley where groundwater elevations have declined by 600 feet. That's taller than this building by about half again. That's a tremendous decrease in water. And so helping educate both the public, the landowners that are going to be responsible for implementing Sigma in many respects, and the GSA has recognized that we had a tremendous drought over the last 5 years. It's going to take a while for things to recover. And we've been in critical overdraft in some basins for the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It's not going to turn around on a dime. It's going to take a long effort, 20 years, or maybe more in some cases, of concentrated planning and focused effort to make this succeed. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, and if there's any questions from the public.
Thank you. Well said. I want to turn to the board, but do we have any cards? No cards? If you wish to speak, fill out a blue card and give it to Ms. Townsend.
Yeah, excellent summary, Eric. Thank you. And you laid out a lot of the key points. Circling back, to, Sam, to your presentation and the development of these algorithms that are scalable, that seems to me like a good example of technical assistance that we could provide to a local GSA, in terms of when they're starting to get together those challenges about water budget, identifying extractors. I don't want you to seem a little glum, Sam, that we aren't able to do more intervention at this time.
He looks
with all
pretty
these,
happy to me.
Oh, okay, he's happy now. With all these great tools we've developed, right? But I was struck by how useful that work that you did could be for the local agencies. And have you had those discussions, and are there any examples you want to point to?
Yeah, I think it's a moving trend in water resources now is water resources information management, and our Office of Information Management and Greg Gerhardt and all the efforts they're doing to kind of make data more available. This is kind of along the similar vein of, this is a lot of information that we have kind of locked up in individual databases within the state infrastructure. And there's now tools and the staff coming along to use those tools to kind of integrate different databases. And so I think we can certainly kind of show how we did it, show our homework. It's using kind of our software, which is free, which is a nice reason to use it for everyone. But so I think it does kind of follow along in that open data framework that the board is starting to focus on and becoming a priority. And we'd be happy to show kind of how, for this specific question, we utilize some of those concepts, but I think there's a lot of other kind of opportunities there, as well as how we can make the data more useful for these kind of like very specific decision processes or policy actions.
No, definitely. I'm glad you pointed out that the open data element of it as well. But clearly, you know, if I'm a local GSA in a disadvantaged area, part of a basin, having to work with others on a GSP, these tools that you've already developed, I can now just take off of the state, you know, take from the state board or the DWR and go to work on, you know, getting a rough water budget together without hiring an expensive consultant maybe, you know, and I think that was the spirit behind, you know, the state technical assistance, or part of it anyway. And we'll talk about it more, but, you know, the GSA formation process was non-trivial, successful. A host of different stories and diversity of circumstances and geopolitical realities. Clearly there were a lot of JPAs were probably formed. You had specific irrigation districts. You have the alternative process where existing plans and structures are in place. I also noted that there was some legislative activity, you know, where special act districts were formed under the leadership of Senator Cannella and VDAC and others, which, you know, I made a point to recognize it. When we look at some of the sustainable groundwater management that's happening today, these are in places where special act districts were set up in the late 60s in some cases, and I won't name names. But this is a really a functional governance structure, and so I'll be interested, you don't have to rattle it off right now, but I think that's part of this story, is what kind of institutional diversity is out there and what are the tools there, because I think that's still a moving target. You know, we met the deadline, but these GSAs will form, you know, probably coalesce in some cases as the GSP challenges present themselves. So, so yeah, you don't have to necessarily go into detail on that. And then finally, I wanted to crosswalk a little bit, you know, our work that we did in 2013 that helped, you know, in its own humble way, spur discussions about groundwater sustainability in our state. We had an issue paper, or a white paper a concept paper, I believe we called it. And we had 5 elements that we talked about, what we thought was needed for a sustainable groundwater plan and institutional framework. And as we go forward in looking at groundwater sustainability plans that are proposed, are we still thinking of these 5 elements that we proposed that, you know, be part of what any state intervention might look like? And those elements were setting benchmarks for groundwater basins, both quality and quantity. And then number 2, monitoring and reporting program. And number 3, having legal authority to manage the basin. Number 4, charging fees to finance the local management. And number 5, having an enforcement program, including authority to curtail pumping in cases where there's certain benchmarks aren't met. So those 5 elements, do you see that still resonating in the discussions as we look forward to what a groundwater sustainability plan will look like?
I'll ask Trevor to touch on this topic specifically as he kind of developed the regulations that I think address each and every one of these.
Yeah, so thank you. No, those are, it's interesting. I was racking my brain, to be honest, trying to remember those. I'm glad you brought them up, but that document really was kind of revolutionary, and we, you know, a lot of attention drawn to those points. And when you laid them out like that, we absolutely have those in either the regulations or statute. They're all there. The benchmarks, that's something actually we carried forward very specifically in the regulations. The way I interpret that is we were very clear in wanting to make sure that we didn't have kind of qualitative
definitions of sustainability that are going to be very hard to figure out whether or not anybody's achieved them. And so we use terms like minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. Of course, that was actually in the act, but we took that and made sure that those quantitative objectives, that it's going to be very clear that when sustainability is hopefully achieved, that doesn't mean that there can't be some adaptive management and that evolve over time, but that item, it resonates very, very clearly with me. Monitoring reporting, again, very much directly in the regulations, also laid out in the statute. A very detailed monitoring and reporting requirements, and again, some of the best management practices that I flashed up touch on that very closely. You know, legal authority and fee authority, the way I look at those are clearly established in the Act, giving those GSAs that coverage. They need that authority in order to make progress on their plans. And then, of course, the final one being the enforcement, the state board involvement, and you know, that's obviously something that this group in particular is responsible for and involved in. So yeah, those are really carried through, in my opinion, into the Act and the regulations.
I'm particularly fond of the locals first approach too,
Oh,
which
yeah,
is really
clearly
played out beautifully so far.
The only comments I would just make are, and this has been a nice opportunity to be able to sort of cap off what has been a lot of work that has gone into these GSA formations over these last years. The 99% coverage, 99% plus coverage is a testament to that, and so it's like it's a nice moment to pat ourselves on the back a bit and say, we have done something here. This is significant, and use that then into the momentum, to Eric, your point, of the real work now over these next years, which is going to be difficult. But hopefully this is indicative of the successes we'll continue to see in the program, and that ultimately what I am really excited about is the capacity building that you all are doing in the communities with the locals to manage their resources. There is that, we keep bringing it up, but it is so critical to the success of this to have communities themselves growing their capacity and sophistication and ability to manage their water resources, groundwater, which has knock-on effects, as you all well know, on surface water then, and all the other ways that we manage the resource. So it's not just about necessarily the capacity that's being built to manage groundwater, but the resource as a whole. And it's exciting then to see how that will just benefit the smart management of the resource in general. So thank you guys for your tremendous work.
It's great. Yeah, it's really, it's interesting to be able to watch something unfold over time. You have to be prepared for the worst, and I just remember all of those early conversations, and it's a joy to see, not just in the stats on the page, but in the conversations with people on the field, in the field, the conversations with folks who come in to talk to us, to ask for advice, and who may have trouble with their neighbors and are trying to anticipate it. But I mean, just out in the field, the sheer amount of energy that's going into this very hard task is great, which means all those people in the coffee shops and bars who said, you guys have got to do this and do it this way, we know we need to act. I'm always happy when the coffee shops and bars are correct, but it's a real testament. You all have done a great job together. The folks out in the field have the real heavy lifting, and I know that the work ahead, as Eric and all of you have said, is going to be, these are really hard choices and decisions people are going to need to make. It's almost like they're the founding mothers and fathers of, a governance structure about how to share an essential resource and replenish it in their own communities, and how to cut back. I mean, it's coming out of local government. I've obviously seen this before. It's the magic of our system, but it's something that does require folks to come together and collaborate with each other across weird divides and become a we, rather than just fighting with each other over a piece of paper or something they've been told for years. It really means rolling up their sleeves to figure out how to make something happen for the future. So thank you for honoring that and helping folks in all the different ways we can help folks do that. And I look forward to the next report and us all sort of holding hands and going for local success, wishing for local success and helping it as the next tough years unfold. So it's absolutely a privilege to watch. Okay, we don't have any cards. That's interesting. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Look forward to the future on this one. I'm going to suggest a 10-minute break before item number 5, just out of morning courtesy. So we'll come back at 11:25, 11:26, more or less. All right. We are back. It is 11:28. Sorry, I know. Hopefully there are people watching online, but I'm been looking forward to this update, something we were asked for after another presentation earlier, and so I appreciate the ongoing conversation. So really appreciate you all coming back to talk about this one. Item number 5.
Great, thank you so much. While we're getting the PowerPoint up, I'll get us started.
Thanks.
Sure. So I'm Amanda Montgomery, and I'm the program manager in the Division of Water Rights in the permitting section. And before we get started in today's item, I just wanted to give a little bit of background on water rights, just for a minute or two, since we have a newer board member. So the Division of Water Rights issues new water rights. So that is most typically a water rights permit. It can also be a water rights registration. And we also make changes to existing water rights, such as permits and licenses. Licensing is the step beyond permitting where you kind of confirm your right after you've used it. And we also do other types of water rights change petitions that are associated with fisheries projects, such as in-stream flow dedications. Sometimes those are referred to by the Water Code section, Water Code section 1707. And our petition staff also do a little bit of work on wastewater change petitions, which are, we won't talk about here because they're not usually related to anything fish friendly, but that's where a party is reducing flows in the stream to boost recycled water. So when we are processing these items that I've described, new permits, change petitions, in that process, there are certain aspects that Division of Water Rights staff are doing. And there are certain aspects that the applicant or the petitioner is doing. So it's a little bit of back and forth, such as like a water availability for a new permit. Most commonly, that's actually done by the applicant, by their consultant, some type of engineering firm. Sometimes division staff does that, but more commonly they do it. So, and then other aspects in the process squarely fall on our shoulders. An example would be when you're at the end of the line and you're getting ready to issue, you have to make certain findings, and those findings are squarely falling in the board's lap. So those are things like, we really can't issue any of these type of projects unless it's in the public's interest. Unless it won't harm other legal users of water. So those could be like the senior water rights in the watershed. And also that it won't harm in-stream resources, because that could be fish, wildlife, and also recreation. So those are things that we're considering before these projects get to the end of the line. While it's going through the process, we also have to comply with all existing water rights law and regulations, and we have to comply with policies. So one thing that you'll hear about today is this North Coast in-stream flow policy. That was adopted by the board in 2010 and I think updated in 2014. That's one of the things that staff have to comply with in the project is in that area. And that's in a 5-county area that's in the coast: Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, Marin, and that area. So Humboldt, parts of Humboldt. So with that, with a little bit of background on water rights, just enough to pique your interest, we'll start getting into today's item. So today's item will be a presentation by Division of Water Rights staff and a member of Trout Unlimited. And we will talk about an item that came before the board in February 23rd, 2017 by Trout Unlimited and by Cal Trout. They were discussing before the board restoring ecological functions through coordinated water management approaches. And during that item, we had comments that we received from Trout Unlimited about some concerns and thoughts on the water rights process for these fish-friendly projects. So that's really what we're here to talk with you about today. So we will focus on kind of what are our existing processes for this, what are our kind of the efforts towards improvement, and so we're just getting towards the end point of how can we most efficiently process water right applications and petitions to provide ecological benefits for fish and wildlife. So I'll introduce today's panel. So we have Scott Fraser, who's a senior environmental scientist in the permitting section. And then next we have his staff person, Elizabeth Hessam. She's an environmental scientist in the permitting section. And finally, we have Matt Clifford, a staff attorney for Trout Unlimited's California Water Project. And with that, I'll turn it over to Scott and we'll start our talk. And we're open to any questions or comments you have as we go along or at the end.
Sounds great.
Thank you, Amanda. So I think by all accounts, the previous presentation was pretty outstanding. So it's a hard one to follow, but we're going to do our best.
Took years to get there.
This may come off a little dry, but we're just trying to be prepared.
That's all right.
All right. So the February 2017 board presentation that Amanda mentioned in her opening remarks included a fairly lengthy discussion on water rights permitting and for projects that enhance conditions for fish and wildlife. During this discussion, both Trout Unlimited and CalTrout commented on the lengthy regulatory processes that sometimes delay implementation of these important projects. Speaking from her recent experience in the Mattole and Russian River watersheds during the drought, Marianne King of Trout Unlimited, who couldn't join us today, specifically acknowledged certain aspects of the board's existing water rights programs that have been effective in streamlining and expediting the regulatory review of fish and wildlife enhancement projects. However, she also expressed several concerns regarding existing water rights programs and offered suggestions for improvement in the future. To provide context for her comments during her presentation, she noted that Trout Unlimited's collaborative efforts generally focus on individual landowners in coastal river and stream systems that are not flow regulated, have decentralized water diversion and use, and provide important habitat for endangered salmonids. Just realized I forgot to forward to my first slide, so I apologize for that. One aspect of the board's existing water right programs that Trout Unlimited acknowledged in February is the board's prioritization criteria. The current set of criteria were adopted in 2011 and are applied to all pending water right applications and petitions to help focus staff resources on categories of projects that are priorities for the board. In addition to projects of regional or statewide significance, projects that minimize environmental impacts and enhance conditions for fish and wildlife are also prioritized for processing. These criteria were used successfully during the recent drought to prioritize and expedite several water right projects that directly benefited endangered salmonids in Northern California coastal watersheds, including several projects sponsored or supported by Trout Unlimited. Some examples of the types of fish and wildlife projects that receive priority under the existing criteria include those that enhance flows for fish, those that shift from dry season diversion to wet season diversion, and those that remove on-stream reservoirs and other barriers to fish migration. Another effective aspect of the board's water right programs that Trout Unlimited acknowledged is the existence of policy provisions that allow for alternate and expedited processing pathways for projects that provide clear benefits to fish and wildlife. For example, the State Water Board's policy for maintaining in-stream flows in Northern California coastal streams allows for expedited processing of water right applications and petitions that benefit fish and wildlife, as well as exceptions for certain analysis and diversion requirements, where diversions are reduced under other bases of right and the benefits to fishery resources outweigh the adverse environmental impacts of the project. This policy provision was recently used by Division of Water Rights staff to expedite and streamline the processing of the Dutch Bill Creek Water Conservation and Storage Project in the Russian River watershed in 2015. Sponsored by Trout Unlimited, the project provided a reliable source of irrigation water for a camp and conference facility while leaving water in the creek for endangered salmonids when they needed it most. From a water rights perspective, the project involved issuance of a water right permit for wet season storage and an associated in-stream flow dedication of water previously diverted in the summertime under a riparian claim. Trout Unlimited also kindly acknowledged the diligence and hard work of State Water Board staff as a factor contributing to the efficient and timely processing of water right filings associated with fish and wildlife projects. Division of Water Rights permitting and petition programs were recently augmented with 8 additional staff positions, including 1 staff position dedicated entirely to water right projects funded by the California Wildlife Conservation Board. Environmental scientist Elizabeth Hessam currently holds this position and will be providing you with a more detailed overview of the position and the stream flow enhancement program later in this presentation. The main concern expressed by Trout Unlimited in February was the multi-year permitting and petition approval timelines often don't align well with environmental needs or shorter grant funding timelines. Trout Unlimited also noted that the uncertainty sometimes associated with water right processes, timelines, and cost often discourages interested parties from pursuing cooperative water right projects that would ultimately enhance conditions for fish and wildlife. After voicing their concerns, Trout Unlimited made several suggestions regarding ways in which State Water Board could further expedite and streamline water rights for future fish and wildlife enhancement projects. First, they suggested that Water Board staff use Fish and Wildlife Agency support to help projects identify as fish and wildlife friendly and qualify them for expedited processing, which is a measure already in place under the board's existing prioritization criteria. Second, they suggested that staff develop templates and guidance documents to help project proponents meet their filing requirements and develop supporting analyses and documentation. They also encouraged the board to direct staff to exercise discretion within the confines of existing law and policy when implementing regulatory requirements, which is consistent with ongoing practice within the Division of Water Rights. And lastly, Trout Unlimited encouraged staff to avoid unnecessary analysis and detail wherever possible, and to scale up hydrologic and environmental analyses when appropriate. Both of these concepts are captured in the board's North Coast in-stream flow policy, which applies to water right filings in a significant number of coastal watersheds located in Marin, Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, and Humboldt counties. Similar approaches have been used in watersheds located outside the North Coast in-stream flow policy area as well. Staff will continue to identify opportunities for multi-party and watershed scale analyses as they become available. In response to Trout Unlimited's suggestion regarding templates and guidance documents, Division of Water Rights staff has added example documentation from past projects to the Division website to serve as a resource for future water right applicants and petitioners, including those proposing projects that would benefit fish and wildlife. Additional documentation will be added as it becomes available, along with related guidance materials to assist water right applicants and petitioners in fulfilling the regulatory requirements for their projects. Since February, Division of Water Rights staff has met with Trout Unlimited to identify several additional areas of interest for improving the Division's existing water rights programs for projects that benefit fish and wildlife. One issue we will continue to discuss is how much documentation is needed to pursue the North Coast in-stream flow policy provisions that I mentioned earlier for projects in watersheds without as much existing data as the Russian River. Another idea we feel is mutually beneficial to continue to explore is the possibility of developing an automated water availability screening tool. While we're at the beginning stages of planning what this tool may look like, the concept is an automated water availability screening tool that could be used by the Division of Water Rights and other agencies and NGOs to prioritize, simplify, and expedite the funding, support, and processing of fish and wildlife enhancement projects that have the greatest public and environmental benefit and the highest likelihood of near-term regulatory approval and implementation. Division staff will continue to explore this concept and other areas of interest with Trout Unlimited or any other interested parties that come forward, and will remain open to input from outside parties on other ways to improve the water rights permitting and petition programs in the future. This concludes my portion of the presentation, and I'm going to turn it over now to Elizabeth Hessam, who will describe her duties as the current staff person holding the dedicated water right permitting position funded by the Wildlife Conservation Board.
Well, welcome, Ms. Hessam. Before you get started, though, I just wanted to give you a chance to describe this water availability screening tool a little more. I'm struck by this being kind of a universal need. And that the current haste with which the cannabis program is moving, that there may be some experience that we will be able to benefit from as that rolls out to do more rapid water availability screening. But certainly, so I wanted to maybe comment on that overlap, but also are you looking at using our database eRIMS as part of that and gauging information where available? How do you, and then having this tool sort of compile that information on water rights, water, and then, actual monitoring data, and, are those the type of things you're thinking about and looking into?
Sure. So I'll weigh in on that. So when we started talking to you about this concept, one thing we did was go back within the division and look at similar efforts that might not be completed but are starting to move forward. And there is efforts that are going on both with the cannabis effort with registration, since there is an element of the registrations code that speaks to the division having a role in water availability analysis, since the parties don't necessarily conduct water availability analysis as part of the registration process. And also there's other efforts that have been done on water availability, such as related to curtailment. So we're trying to build on existing information. We did find that the cannabis effort is moving full force towards completion, which we all expect, right, for the fall. So they have a lot of good thinking going on there. It does capitalize on existing gauge data. It also looks at information that's coming out of ERIMS and also like our RMS reporting. It's essential to have an ERIMS aspect to water availability, because what water availability is basically there's a new project. What is the senior demand? What are the in-stream demands? And is there enough left to grant that new project, right? So that part is essential. You have to have all that data from ERIMS, from the gauges, and then also just the aspect of how do we design this most efficiently for the watershed? At what scale? Is it at the HUC scale or at what scale? So we're trying to utilize the information that's being developed for those other programs to feed into what other tool we developed with TU.
That's great. Thank you. And it does resonate also with initiatives that OEMA of our board is working on. Just as an aside to board members, that data challenge that I was a judge on, one of the honorable mentions for the young up-and-comers, I forgot what we called it, the students, was this group that went in to our ERIMS database and did these and developed their own tool to do a quick review of availability of water in the North Coast streams. So we might have to get back in touch with that group of students, but it's certainly, and we recognize as judges the importance of using our existing databases and making them more real-time accessible and useful in a more rapid way. So thanks for that discussion. It's a great answer. Thanks.
All right, moving right along. So as has been mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Hussam. I'm an environmental scientist with the Division of Water Rights, specifically focusing on fish-friendly projects. My position is funded by the Wildlife Conservation Board through a contract with the division. The Wildlife Conservation Board, or as I will refer to it in this presentation, Conservation Board, focuses on selecting, authorizing, and allocating funds for the purchase of land and waters suitable for recreation purposes and for the preservation, protection, and restoration of wildlife habitat. The Conservation Board has its own separate and independent board outside of California Department of Fish and Wildlife, with authority and funding to carry out acquisition and development programs for wildlife conservation. In 2014, the Conservation Board was allocated $200 million through Proposition 1, the Water Quality Supply and Infrastructure Improvement Act, to be dispersed over 5 to 10 years for a stream flow enhancement program. This program focuses on funding projects that meaningfully enhance stream flow. The program defines enhancing stream flow as a change in the amount, timing, or quality of water flowing down a stream to benefit fish and wildlife. The division is helping with the implementation of this program through my contract position with the Conservation Board. Through my position, I am involved in most steps within the grant program, including consulting with applicants, reviewing applications, serving on selection panels, and streamlining the processing of projects through the division. Whereas typical water rights staff normally have 30 to 60 projects on their work slate, I only work on projects that are funded by the Stream Flow Enhancement Program that focus on water right aspects. Doing this allows me to focus on and expedite these fish-friendly projects in order to move them faster through water rights processing. As an example of moving these projects faster through water rights processing, I will briefly discuss a project funded by the Stream Flow Enhancement Program that was completed this year. The project applicant, Galloglass Company, submitted 4 petitions for change and 1 application to appropriate water to an off-stream reservoir. Part of the project focused on authorizing voluntary releases from the off-stream reservoir for fish and wildlife enhancement in nearby Porter Creek, a tributary to the Russian River. The Conservation Board provided grant funding for the construction of permanent in-stream flow release works and associated environmental monitoring. The importance of these releases are that Porter Creek currently supports steelhead spawning and rearing with some natural reproduction of coho salmon. Additionally, several thousand hatchery-reared coho salmon fry are released every year in Porter Creek as a part of the Russian River coho salmon captive broodstock program. The restoration of this habitat and salmonid populations in Porter Creek may play a role in reestablishing of viable steelhead and coho salmon populations in the Russian River. This project was considered a high priority, and after Conservation Board funding was completed within a year.
Projects that have been funded?
Yes, there are. The Wildlife Conservation Board has a list of them on their website.
Great.
So speaking of them, currently the Streamflow Enhancement Program is accepting applications up until August 31st. Some examples of project types eligible for funding include dedicating a portion of a water right to fish and wildlife enhancement, or coordinating summertime forbearance agreements to help forego water diversions. Projects that are selected for funding through this program will be prioritized for water rights processing. This prioritization is a part of the Division and Conservation Board's multi-year continued collaboration to focus on fish-friendly projects. Having this collaboration helps fast-track the Conservation Board's funded programs to meet their funding deadlines and helps the Division complete more fish-friendly projects. The Division is committed to maintaining this collaboration and looks forward to a continued partnership in prioritizing fish-friendly projects. So, with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and pass the presentation on to Matt Clifford of Trout Unlimited.
Thank you. And thanks to both the board and staff. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I'll start by saying my colleague Mary Ann King sends her deepest apologies. I know she really wanted to be here today. She is home quite ill this morning and was not able to make it at the last minute. So my apologies. What I'm going to do here is start with a few remarks and then I'll go ahead and read.
Is the green light on in front of your mic?
Should I start over? So anyway, so what I'm going to do here, sorry, is again, Mary Ann King really wanted to be here, is ill this morning, and I'll start with a few remarks, and I'm going to read her portion of this. We're going to tag team this. I'll read her portion of the testimony, so you'll have her remarks. They just won't sound as good. So to begin with, I would like to step back for a minute and look at the big picture for a second and just describe why it is we're here talking about speeding up water rights permitting process, what led to these discussions. I'm going to try and, I don't really have a PowerPoint. I've got 2 slides.
Yeah, it's 2 slides and a pretty cover.
There it is. Oop,
there you go.
Bury my lead here. So
very soothing.
For the past 10 years or so, Trout Unlimited has been working on a program, has been advancing a program to work on increasing in-stream flows in coastal watersheds, specifically for salmon and steelhead. We do this these days in close partnership with our peer organizations, the Nature Conservancy and California Trout. And I think it's fair to say that there's a number of organizations getting involved, that this work is gaining momentum across the coast. But the work is really dominated by a few factors that I think it's fair to say are not present to the same extent anyway in other parts of California. Some of those are familiar by now. We're talking about generally unregulated systems. There's no big dams. Okay.
Right.
We're talking about places where diversions are small and numerous and widely dispersed across watersheds. And then again, what I will add is that most diversions are under riparian claims of right. And so they're not directly now regulated by the board, and they generally have the right to pump all summer if they, under existing law. So I like to contrast the situation to another stream that I work on in the northern Central Valley, which is Deer Creek, which the board is probably somewhat familiar with. And Deer Creek, there are essentially 2 diverters.
Right.
Not quite this simple, but it's close enough. There's one that's entitled to a third of the creek, a lower one entitled to the other 2/3. So working on stream flow restoration there, it may not be easy, it may take a long time, but at least you know who you're working with and you know where you got to go to get the water. There it is. In contrast, in coastal watersheds, they typically look like, if I hit the right button here, this. And here's just an example of the Russian River and surrounding area. This is what we affectionately call the measles graph in-house at TU because, all the dots, et cetera, just to illustrate the sheer number of points of diversion we're dealing with. And just to drill down a bit to a smaller, I keep hitting the wrong button, a smaller level, this is from the informational order that the board put out during a drought recently and showing points of diversion. A lot of these, of course, are wells, but, a lot of those wells, many or most, affect surface flow.
Right.
And, a great number of them are probably subterranean stream jurisdiction and potential points of diversion.
Yeah,
so
the Russian River is just like a big groundwater river.
There it is.
Kind of like the
Exactly. So there's lots of complications there. And so, cumulatively, to state the obvious, these folks divert a lot of water. Also, to state the obvious, to have a big effect like we need to have at a watershed scale, we've got to work with a lot of them. And I think it's fair to say we know at this point how to do that. There's a suite of project types out there. Scott went into some of them. The prominent among them is storage and forbearance. You store water in the winter, you don't divert in the summer. Also, point of diversion changes and some combination of those and in-stream flow dedication. So we have the suite of solutions. The thing that these have in common is they need generally water rights approvals from this board. Okay, so this means that a significant potential limiting factor on how fast we can get restoration done at scale in these watersheds is just how fast we can move permits through the system. And so that's why we are interested in anything we can do to talk about expediting and identifying good projects and getting them approved as rapidly as possible. So to that end, we have several specific recommendations we'd like to discuss. In addition to what Scott mentioned. Some of them to work better with an existing policy and some to think a bit outside the box and how we might create new policy. So first of all, we recommend expanding, in the new policy category, expanding the availability of small irrigation use registrations beyond the North Coast policy area. Right now there's a good shortcut way for small diverters to get rights. They're available now within the North Coast policy area because that's where general conditions exist. They particularly work well with projects to shift the timing of diversion, as we've been discussing, from summer to winter. They're well suited to that, but they're not available outside the North Coast area. We've been working with the wine industry for the last couple of sessions on bills to try to get that done. There's currently one pending in the legislature, AB 1420, and we'd like to see that move forward. We think that would be a big help outside the North Coast area. Second, and Scott mentioned this as well, we do suggest that the Water Board give direction to staff where possible, to exercise their discretion, where it's within the bounds of existing law and policy to expedite permitting for fisheries enhancement projects. During the permitting process, the Water Board has to obtain the information it needs in order to make the requisite findings it has to make. And in doing so, staff will, of course, determine how much information is needed. And in places where the existing policy doesn't provide a lot of guidance, and I think here 3.3.2.5 is probably a good example, there's probably a natural tendency, we're guessing, to want to be conservative and ask for more information rather than less. I mean, that seems natural. But where we're talking about projects that are designed specifically to benefit fish, and these are projects that are probably called for in the California Water Action Plan, often paid for by state and federal grant agencies, consistent with the principles of the North Coast in-stream flow policy and federal and state recovery plans, and even employing the approaches that the agencies have championed themselves in presentations to water users during the drought, we would hope that there's a way for staff to feel confident that they can support the necessary findings without the same level of technical detail they might require, like for a new application that was looking to irrigate more acreage or a project of that type when we're dealing with a familiar known project type. I think it's here where the exercise of discretion, again, within the bounds of existing law and policy, can affect how quickly the benefit to a stream is realized and how far public funds can go in realizing those benefits, and then how much can be accomplished. I think it's useful, pausing for a second, to make a distinction between, we've talked about fish-friendly projects here, and I think that term sometimes gets applied to projects that maybe someone wants to develop some new water and they'll tack some bells and whistles on for fish in the end, to mitigate impacts, and that's what people mean by fish-friendly. I want to stress that what we're talking about is projects whose whole purpose specifically is to benefit fish, not to do something else and benefit fish along the way. So we're timing switching, things like that. I think that's an important distinction to make. Finally, we recommend that the final recommendation has a lot to do with the person sitting to my left here. We think this is a good model. We recommend that the practice of having a designated staff person to work on projects funded by the Wildlife Conservation Board is a good model, and that continue. And we suggest that other future agencies like CDFW and the Water Board consider extending the scope of this model beyond just WCB-funded projects. This may help ameliorate the problem that Marianne identified back in February, where water rights permitting timelines don't necessarily align well with the time constraints of public grant programs. Those problems are twofold. We often have hard deadlines for completing projects and spending public funds where we just can't wait. We have to get things out the door. And second, we often need to implement a project before the rainy season in order to store water and realize the flow benefit now before the following summer. And so if we miss our short implementation window, we delay the benefit to the creek and fish by a year. So having staff with more familiarity with both sides of the equation, permitting and grant programs, could go a long way toward ensuring that public funds that are spent on permitting are used most effectively and that publicly beneficial projects can be completed on time. I'll pause here before I close just to say the screening tool. I mean, I think we're really encouraged by this conversation with staff about the screening tool. That's a case where I think great minds, turns out, think alike. When we came to a meeting, we had both been thinking about it separately. I think it's an idea with a lot of maybe whose time has come. We think it would be really useful for water users in general to have that information. And the underlying, if the data is good, the underlying math and the underlying problem is not, well, one can see how it could get done without a lot of fancy math. It's not technically a terribly challenging thing to do, but there's a lot of challenges along the way in thinking what's it going to contain and how do we get the underlying data right. But a lot of potential. So I'd like to conclude by thanking the board and the staff, especially Amanda, Scott, and Tom, for lending their time and expertise on this topic. They've given a lot of thought to the questions that Mary Ann raised back in February. And we especially appreciate their thoughtful exchange of ideas and proactive feedback and suggestions. And thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you. I have a few questions, but I'll turn to my colleagues first.
So the Conservation Board has a list of their projects, obviously, but when it comes to, I guess, those projects that would benefit from better interagency coordination or anything, is there sort of thought about creating sort of a comprehensive list so that we can see which projects that are needing sort of better tracking, perhaps internal for us at the board, but then also just externally to other stakeholders, or some sort of dashboard that kind of better lists and summarizes, I guess, the projects that are out there, what their status is, what is still needing to be done, and where they fall insofar as sort of priorities.
Sure. So I'll take that one since I'm the program manager for it. In general, we can do that sort of thing, and we'll start working on that. We have a website for the 1707 in-stream flow dedications. That might be a natural place to put that type of information. We do have certain types of tracking that are not related generally just to fish. We track all the pending applications in a report called the 1259, Water Code 1259 report every year. It's kind of what within that 5-county area where the in-stream flow policy is, because that's where most of our water rights new permitting happens. So the vast majority of the applications are there. But it is possible to create a sub-list or another list that has the fish-friendly projects. Definitely the ones that are primary. Maybe we could pull those out separately than the ones that Matt Clifford was mentioning that are more of a secondary purpose. The secondary purpose projects still have tremendous benefit. It's just not the same level of benefit as the ones that are just primarily for the fisheries. So we could pull those out separately. We can do that. So.
I know on the federal side, there were some reforms that were made to sort of transportation permitting or permitting in general, and they created what's known as a permitting dashboard, where all the agencies sort of feed into so that you can see where you are in a certain project and to kind of foster this greater interagency coordination. Obviously, the difficulty, as you already said, is oftentimes your grants require you to spend by a certain date, and when it comes to our processes, they can take longer. They're not as certain sometimes, but the more, I guess, we can build that certainty into at least our side of the equation, perhaps, see some benefits. So.
Good. I know the importance of this program, and I appreciate Trout Unlimited and others working hard with private landowners around the state. I'm familiar, Mary Ann King and I have discussed this with Board Member Diadamo as well. Just the strength of these small projects, and if they're scaled up on a watershed basis, what a huge difference it can make. Because we're blessed with an overabundance of water in our wet season often in these areas versus the human use is actually a fraction thereof, but the timing is all off. And just we've been sort of, as we develop water in a more laissez-faire way, there becomes a tragedy of the commons that's very solvable, but part of the equation is this idea, as you said, forbearance tank projects that are on the scale of the map that we're looking at. That does make a difference quantitatively if it all adds up. So to me, I look at it as a water budget, water manager, water master challenge, on these scales that can be met. So, and I'm also impressed with our staff and your dedication to these principles, knowing that this is part of the grand solution in California is to look at timing and magnitude of flows to be able to strike balance on beneficial uses. And our staff recognizes that our permitting process is part of, being part of the team to realize the benefits of this, dealing with the timing and the magnitude of our flows in our state. So this is a critical tool, and I want to just, again, thank Trout Unlimited and partners for working with private property owners. That's a nexus that the regulator, it's not as easy for us to make. We really benefit from the intermediary function to build trust. Part of our building trust, though, as our staff recognizes, is a timely permitting process that respects folks kind of getting outside of their comfort zone, taking risk. And so as we look at the tools that you all have worked on in the last few years, this is all fairly new. There isn't a long list of projects like the Gallo Glass project, which has multiple water rights and fish benefits. But, looking ahead, I'm interested in what additional, maybe legislation you mentioned that might be useful to create more efficiencies. But I'm not clear on what more we can do other than recognize timelines on a project-by-project basis, like when the grants have to be expended. I'm sure, Elizabeth, you look at that and say, okay, well, I got to get this done because we have a calendar-based need. But I wanted to give you a chance to, talk a little bit about that being kind of a new program and what you see the challenges and the opportunities ahead.
So as I mentioned before, it's kind of a two-party process, right? There's the division's role and the applicant or the petitioner's role. So there's things we can continue to do on our side. One is just time as we do more of these. Understanding how we got through it with Project A can help us with Project B. So, and having that kind of training of staff as new staff come on board, that they understand how past projects were dealt with and how we were able to expedite it, and try to translate that across to the other ones. And the other aspects that we can work on is just continuing to emphasize to staff the need to prioritize these projects, to look for creative solutions for them, and to just really be putting on our thinking cap about how to move each project forward. We already do that. We have early management input into these type of projects. We try to screen out policy issues that come up early so we can work out solutions, but we can continue to do that strategy. On the applicant or the petitioner side, continuing to provide examples on our website, help them on the front end to design submittals to us that kind of give us the right rock instead of the wrong rock. So
That's good.
So we'll continue to provide tips documents, give them ideas on how we can mutually work together to be efficient in that process. And also, as they do more projects, they'll be more savvy on how to get them through the process. So I think we're moving towards a future where we'll have a lot more of these, but we'll also have a lot more expertise on how to handle them efficiently.
Thank you. Good answer. I wanted to drill down a little bit on the small irrigation use because we had talked about this in the briefing. It's a wonderful idea, a tool to try to expedite projects that really make sense and are time sensitive, and yet it hasn't really been enrolled in on a great number. There's only been about 15 or so enrollees in the small irrigation use permit in that whole swath of 5 counties. That's the reality. But you mentioned there might be some constraints that we built in, to that process that perhaps we need to revisit so that it becomes less of or becomes more of an attractive tool that then we could expand under something like AB 1420 to other counties.
Right. So the existing small irrigation use program does have certain restrictions that might make it not as desirable. For example, it needs to be, if you're going to build a new pond, it needs to be on land that's already been disturbed. That's part of making sure that we don't have a CEQA challenge there, right? That there's not an issue with, not a CEQA challenge in a legal sense, but a CEQA challenge in we want to make sure that it's a low threat project. So there's certain aspects to that that might not be that attractive to, say, a vineyard producer who does not want to take out vines on existing disturbed land to put in a pond. But in general, the pathway there does exist. I'm not exactly sure why we haven't seen as many as we expected. I think, originally targeted that we might see 40 to 60, and like you said, we've seen less than 15. It's hard to say what that reason is. The process that we have right now is that if the party is interested in a small irrigation use, they fill out our form in a draft sense, and then they provide it to CDFW, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And California Department of Fish and Wildlife provides the conditioning for the public trust for the fisheries resources. And then once they have that conditioning or confirmation that no conditioning is needed, they come back to us and we process it through. So that seems that it should work out, but there's factors outside of our control with that, with the CDFW processing. So I know that they diligently work on those projects, but it has to get through that process. I think the most effective thing would be if we were able to have a set of conditions for the public trust conditioning that are set up front. So there doesn't have to be individual project negotiations. That would be the most efficient thing. It is difficult to do that. Even in the AB 2121 North Coast In-Stream Flow Policy area, that policy is about applications and petitions, not so much about registrations. So there's not something we can just grab out of that per se. So it is a bit of a challenge of how do you condition these. It'll be interesting to see how cannabis moves forward, since that is a small irrigation use registration program, and there probably could be lessons learned there, even if it's not the exact approach, but lessons learned from that it could apply to other crops. So.
Well, great. And then one last thing, I appreciate in your briefing notes pointing out, the workload you're grappling with. You say 380 applications pending, 560 petitions. That's a great volume of expectation, and so there is a valid concern that fish-friendly projects could get lost in that. And yet, as we've discussed, there is an opportunity to leverage our goals under the action plan to do ecosystem recovery and to reward applicants that may have water rights change needs, but then could also build in bypass flows, off-stream storage, fish barrier removal, forbearance and tank project, all these, just a package of items that could go with water rights changes that they feel are necessary, and us providing an incentive to do that by bringing those type of projects higher in the priority system. And are you using that incentive at all, or isn't the Gallo Glass project kind of an example of that?
Sure. So the Gallo Glass project was a pending application and pending change petitions for irrigation purposes for vineyard in the Russian River before it turned into having a fish-friendly component to it. So I don't know their exact reasons for changing their project, but our prioritization criteria involving fish-friendly projects being prioritized is on our website. It's been up there since about 2011. So I suppose if I was waiting in line and I was savvy, I would look at that and try to think, how can I make my project hit some of those priority things so that it moves up in line? And I think that a number of projects may change for those reasons. Another reason why a project might change to become more fish-friendly is as it goes through the protest process. So our water rights applications or petitions are generally publicly noticed, definitely for applications. And as they're publicly noticed, there's a process for parties to object to the project. They could object to the project on environmental grounds. And if they do, they go into like a negotiation process. And sometimes projects change for that reason as well. So.
Well, people can also protest on legal user of water grounds.
You definitely can do that. You may see a fish-friendly aspect come out of a legal user of water grounds. It's just more likely that it comes out of the environmental protest grounds. Usually the legal user of water grounds is that they're concerned that they're more senior and that the new project or change would in some way impact their senior rights. So it doesn't usually tend to be as much about fisheries there.
No, but you still have to resolve those concerns. I mean, when I think about this and I think about all these dots, and if each one of them is a single process, it seems impossible to ever, if there's a mountain, we'll never, I'm sure there's a great metaphor or fairy tale or something about it that if I were more alert, I could come up with. But I apologize for missing my pre-briefing. I really did want to have it, but legislation called. So I'm just going to want to do a follow-up afterwards, because I want to understand why we can't come up with more options to do whole swaths of streams together. The whole idea of taking these as one-off seems an impossible way to actually help either the water resources, the water right holders, or, fish. So it just strikes me there's got to be a better way.
Right. And
Because otherwise you guys are in an impossible situation no matter how much if you prioritize too many things, then everybody else who's doing a non-fish project is even longer in the queue, and that's not good either. So I'm sort of looking for other outside the box suggestions, even if they involve legislation. Because otherwise we're not made out of people, and we can't, maybe we could designate another person, but you all don't have enough staff as it is, even though I'm glad to be here during an administration that's increased your staffing. But
so we're open to any ideas, either outside of the box or inside the box. I would point out a few things.
You changed
One
the
is
box,
that,
right?
One is that the North Coast in-stream flow policy does have a pathway, something called a watershed charter. That is the idea that a group could come together with a suite of applications or petitions and process them as a group and do all that analysis as one. That concept, I think, came from the Anderson Creek watershed up in the North Coast. So I think that the structure's there within our process to use that if we're talking about, kind of within what we already have. And then there's a lot of ideas for, there's possibilities for doing things outside of the box. We're interested in your thoughts on it. And there is that legislation that's moving forward that Matt mentioned.
Well, and that's key, and thank you, Chair Marcus, for pointing that out, that there has to be some kind of scaling of this effort, but there has to be a proof of concept too. And thanks to Trout Unlimited and others and our staff working diligently, we're creating that proof of concept that creates confidence in us and Fish and Wildlife, in the landowners, that this type of process can work and work for everyone. But we should be poised and ready to be able to scale up in a big way. And with the cannabis program coming in and with a lot of expectations of rapid development of tools and analyses, I think we all need to be strategic and leverage that important issue to create tools that will enable us to climb that mountain, or whatever the metaphor might be. The overwhelming,
Ford the stream? No.
the overwhelming, potentially overwhelming number of cases. And actually this year in WQCC, we're going to have an item where all the regional board and state board members get together. We're going to have an item on using innovative technology to monitor compliance. It seems kind of, but the idea there, the spirit behind that is, how do we, in programs like cannabis, irrigated lands, industrial stormwater, you name it, where you have a lot of enrollees, water rights, diverters, how do we have an effective, credible regulatory program? And can we use innovative technology? So, and we mentioned the OEMA, our data analytics as being part of that. Also on the data collection side, what are some things we can do from using satellite data and other things to really, leapfrog in terms of the quantum change that we need to make, to take these fairly down-to-earth principles, store the water in the winter so we can use it in the summer, and facilitate that simple down-to-earth principle in our programs. So, and then, the idea of doing wholesale to cover not just on the ones, but in the hundreds, that would be the goal. And, I think we would encourage you to continue to work toward that.
Do we have cards? No cards. Well, let's just consider, oh, there's a card. Yeah, you need to turn it into her so she knows. That's quite all right. Thank you. I thought I saw you get up and get a card. So a lot of times people get their cards and then they don't turn them in, so. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Oh, perfect. That's why you're familiar. Marjorie Casely?
Casely, yeah.
Casely from California Department of Fish and Wildlife. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I would thank Mary Ann King for alerting me to that you guys were going to do this today.
Yeah,
So
perfect.
I'm involved with our fisheries restoration grants program, and we've been getting feedback also from Trout Unlimited that they would like us to fund more water conservation projects, and so I would attest that we've had struggles in the past with matching our grant timelines to the process for 1707s, and so I'm very encouraged by what's being discussed here today. And so, I guess the thing that I would, I don't know what the workload is for the new staff member, but if there were a way that we could get other Prop 1 or department water conservation projects sort of in her basket instead of others' baskets, that would be, I don't know if that would be a possibility or not, probably not, but I wanted to bring that up. But I would
need
also
to find another bucket of funding because I'm sure the
right.
water
I'm sure. So
Wildlife Conservation
but I
Board
guess,
probably doesn't want us spending on other projects.
Something that I would like to have happen would be for I know that we've in the past tried to coordinate with our program and the Water Rights Division before, and it seems like we've got a new momentum going, and so we'd like to get together with our leads meetings that we have regularly, and as we're updating our proposal solicitation notice for next year, that seems like a good time to do that. So I just wanted to indicate that I would probably talk to them after the meeting. So.
Thank you so much. So next year we'll have a presentation like our groundwater presentation with the seamless handoff between the two programs, which would be perfect. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Well, that's the spirit of the action plan.
There you go.
You know,
But
alignment of the agencies.
Yeah.
Camyar would be tickled.
All right. So let's consider this an early conversation still and a work in progress in terms of really, I still haven't heard the bigger ideas and how they might work, but I know I need to spend time with you all with some maps and understand the limitations, and then I can maybe be more helpful. It seems like this is a place where I thought we had programs that would yield tons of advancement, then I realized they're narrower geographically or otherwise than I had thought they were. So let's try and holistically deal with it, because the last thing we want is for our processes to be holding up good projects. On the other hand, there are always unintended consequences, and I see your point, and that was helpful, that you don't all of a sudden want people putting ponds and tanks in undisturbed areas and creating their own environmental problems, and that's part of the complexity of looking at water rights. It's not just the amount of water and the timing, it's how it's diverted and where and all that. So looking at the whole picture is important. Just strikes me that looking at it holistically on these watersheds makes sense. I know we've prioritized the 5, but even within the 5, how are we taking it to the pilot perfection, replicability, scalability, whatever itty word we need to throw in there. We think about it strategically. Plus, don't we know everybody individually on a lot of these dots from the conservation owner? So, exactly. All right, any other comments? Anything to toss in? All right, thank you very much
Keep
for
up the good
coming in
work.
and sharing this part of the conversation with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Interesting. All right, and before we recess until tomorrow's workshop, we have 2 items on the agenda, and we get all of our closed sessions tomorrow that we are in fact having.
Yes, we will
One
be having
personnel
both
and water,
tomorrow.
we're doing the water fix too?
Yes.
Okay.
And we'll be
good.
doing them both tomorrow.
Okay, terrific. Executive Director's Report.
So there were just 2 things I wanted to call out in this month's Executive Director's Report. The first, actually, Mr. Kraus stole our thunder this morning, but
Right,
you saw
thank
the
you.
Division of Water Rights has started putting more detail on the big, currently active hydro projects that are going through the FERC relicensing process and where we stand with the certification. And we've agreed with the stakeholders, as you heard from Mr. Kraus today, how we will report any slippages that may occur in that schedule as well. The other thing I wanted to call out was several months ago, a couple of the board members, I think Ms. Marcus, you were leading this charge, asked for some additional detail from the Office of Enforcement in the Executive Director's report. And so today you will see more of a narrative on some of their ongoing projects so that you
Yeah, I
have
did.
context for them. And I think that will
Personal
continue to
early.
be a work in progress, but I believe it's more helpful for the public as well as for the board members.
No, thank you. And I spoke with them before they wrote that this is a good start. And then as with all the other reports, we'll refine it over time. But I appreciate it, and I appreciate them checking in with me.
Yeah, likewise. And also just responsive to, I thought it would be a good idea to even look at notices of violation, just as an enforcement action, but with, sort of a progressive enforcement tally. And so I was glad to see that. More to take credit, that it takes work to do that, and it's worth noting that type of volume, not that in a quota type way, but just that there is productivity in those areas, and something that folks' efforts, it would be, aggregated on a regular basis. Are we looking at every month for this, or is this going to be more like a quarterly report, or what was the vision behind that again for the enforcement summary?
My understanding was for them, they are going to essentially roll most of those changes so that they appear in the monthly reports that we prepare. But I think you will see significant passages of time just because the scale of some of these enforcement actions. You won't see updates on some of the narratives every month.
Right, and then they might focus on highlighting some of the regional stuff, et cetera, different points of time, just so that we get a better snapshot over time of what the intention is and what they're prioritizing. And we could obviously also do a kind of a presentation that some, but not all of the regions do, or the enforcement staff sort of do a presentation for their boards on what their priorities are going to be and take input from
the board, their boards, yeah.
Yeah, I just want a clearer sense of what our priorities are in enforcement, and the converse is what we're not doing, so that people who are thinking we're not doing anything, realizing each year we're making choices as to what to go after, so that you can have a more concentrated impact on the issue.
Yeah, because certainly this wasn't completely comprehensive, nor should it be.
Right.
This is a snapshot, and I remember in discussing it with the staff as well, having a similar level of detail as the other divisions was a good start, in terms of a page or two, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, depending on the level of activity and new information. Perfect. That's great. I think it was very worthwhile and an interesting challenge, because with enforcement, you don't want to, there's only so much that it's responsible to reveal.
That's correct. But there is that whole general deterrence thing, too. All right, good. Board member reports. Thank you. These are really good. I hope that people who submit them realize we actually do read them, so that we're...
Last week, I had the pleasure of being in Annapolis, Maryland, for the National Governor Association's Water Policy Institute, which is, it was just a 2-day conference, and is part of their Water Policy Learning Network initiative that Governor Brown is a co-chair of. It was fantastic. We had 30 states represented there, both agencies and then also governor's staff, and touched on a whole host of issues, financing, stormwater issues. We touched a bit on water recycling, but there was a sort of common, thread insofar as a lot of states were really wanting to hear more about constituents of emergency concern and how states are all kind of dealing with that. So I think we might try to make it part of a more focused webinar on that, and maybe we can speak to some of the great work that I know we're doing here in the state. But next year, the Water Policy Institute will be held here in California, so we'll host it. And so we look forward to starting to think and brainstorm and plan where that might be and how we might structure the topics that we'll cover on that one. But it was a fantastic event. Like I said, having all those states represented, you find a lot of commonality and a lot of great work that's being done out there. DC Water gave a pretty great presentation on obviously all the great work they're doing and the financing side, and then also on energy water nexus type work as well that they've, it's a lot of innovative folks out there. So it's good to be able to learn from our sister states. So.
Yeah, it's inspiring, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's just, it's comforting. Is that the word you used? Yeah, it's
Yeah,
great.
and as much as, I'm biased and pretty proud of all the leadership this state has shown, and, we always kind of feel we're ahead of the pack, and we are in many regards. There are still a number that we're not, and there's a lot to learn from other states and, the water policy challenges and that they've been able to address. And so it's as much as it's an opportunity for us to give, it's really a great opportunity for us to learn as well. So it was good.
Terrific.
Thank you. I'll just mention one thing. Our partnership with the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, or GoBiz, in the Lean Six Sigma program has really yielded a lot of interesting benefits for our agency. But I participated or just attended this annual Greenbelt Project Summary meeting, but it was of multiple state agencies. So, there's a long list here, 10, and I'll give you one example, that might hit close to home. But just so proud of our staff, taking these things on, looking at analytically at our processes and seeing certain levels of performance and setting targets and looking at ways to really improve what boils down to really, I see, is our public service. We're public servants. And helping people navigate the mystery and the web of our processes, whether financing or regulatory, and it's just inspiring to see staff step up and identify ways to improve. So I wanted to acknowledge our new green belts from the state board. We have Caitlin McCarthy, who works for Christine Sotelo in the ELAP program, which we've been hearing a lot about, the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program under our Division of Drinking Water for laboratory certification. And, the issue of getting accreditations complete. And we inherited the program and it needs work, but we were just a small pilot project. Accreditation typically takes 170 days. And so the pilot implementation of a new process resulted in 95% of laboratories being completed within 60 days. So going from 170 to 60 in accreditation. And you can imagine what's at stake. If you're a private lab or even a municipal lab, you need to have accreditation to be able to use these data in decision-making and regulatory programs, et cetera. So that, was just a great project. And also we heard from Janelle Brown of the Central Valley Water Board in NPDES permitting, which is close to my heart because I used to do that for 4 years back in the 90s. And just the timeline of getting an administrative draft, which is the early draft of the NPDES permit, out from the point of getting an application. Again, a similar number, 170 days, and looking at doing improvements that would get 95% within 45 days, getting the admin draft out. That doesn't mean that gets permit issued, but it was great seeing all these other state agencies listen to Janelle Brown's presentation. She talked about things like reasonable potential. And I looked around the audience, I didn't see a lot of recognition of what that might mean, but I knew what it meant.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal getting that analysis done for pollutants in discharges. So, but it was, so we're proud of our participants. But yeah, there are really interesting projects around the different state agencies, one of which is the Department of Motor Vehicles and the time it takes to get your vanity plate. And so that was Andrew Conway was the champion. Eric Suter was the analyst who took from the average time of 105 days to get your vanity plate. You pay good money and you got to wait over 3 months to get the vanity plate, but not under his improvements, it was reduced to 62 days.
Well, that's pretty great. So here's the next question, though, is what is that review about? A lot of it is making sure you don't say okay to something you regret later. So I want to know how he accelerated that screening.
All right, on the vanity plate?
Yeah.
That's right. And, they have to look out for unintended bad things on those plates. That's
right.
true.
Right. Or else they end up in my Twitter feed.
Anyway, so I just want to thank
Oh, that's great that you went. I
GoBiz.
saw that you went. I thought that was great.
Yeah, and support staff in those efforts. And it's not going to work in every case, but certainly it's something we should always be looking at, what's holding things up. And, we even talked about that with the Trout Unlimited efforts and, taking a good look at our permitting processes to make sure we don't get in our own way of achieving our mission and vision here at the State Water Board.
That's great. That's great. I've just been spending time on legislation largely since our last meeting, and I will say, since I will miss her debut because I will be on vacation, that the other big thing in the last 2 weeks was the announcement of our new executive director, Eileen Sobek, who I won't steal the thunder of everyone introducing her next week. I just want to thank everybody for their hard work on the process and just say how delighted I am that she'll be joining us in just a couple of weeks. And I'm sorry I won't be here, but I'm sure you'll have a grand welcome, and there'll be plenty to do. And I'll save my thanks for you, Mr. Loffer, later on. All right, we recess until tomorrow's workshop. Thank you.